They did it voluntarily. Let them go, scam. You bitches, you forced them. You forced them, you absolute wankers.
Russians are abandoning the army, and Putin's new mobilization plan is sparking a riot before it's even been announced. The doors of Russian registration centers have long been shrouded in deep silence. People are now openly reluctant to go to the front lines. Look, leaked footage on social media shows Putin desperately searching for soldiers. But first, a small request. Independent frontline and geostrategic analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd be interested. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It only takes a few seconds. Now let's pick up where we left off. In Penza, Kamenets, and Kuznetsk, police, Rosgvardia, and military recruitment office officials are conducting mass raids. Men are being snatched off the streets, crammed into pickup trucks, and presented with a Ministry of Defense contract at the recruitment office.
On what grounds are you taking them? Why did you make them get off the bus and take them away?
And the stopgap solution the Kremlin has come up with is driving people to anger and rebellion. In a widely shared video, a woman recounts what happened to her husband. The police stopped her drunk husband on the road, took him to the police station, and placed some papers in front of him.
He thought it was just a protocol, but they gave him a contract. My husband would never have agreed to this because we have a family at home, we have 4 children.
The man thought it was just a routine report. What they made him sign was a war contract. In the woman's words, her husband would never have agreed to this. Another post sums up the situation in a single sentence. Armed men are entering workplaces and outright declaring civilians to be soldiers. No consent, no choice. Ignore politics for long enough, and one day, politics will come knocking at your door in uniform.
Shut your mouth and behave with dignity. What are you all yelling for? I say, you are all military men. All the toys are over. You are all military.
So are these scattered clips really pieces of one much bigger picture? The answer came from one of the most authoritative witnesses there is. Denis Kapustin, founder and commander of the Russian Volunteer Corps, issued an open warning to the Russian people in an interview with Channel 24, and summed up the trajectory of the war in a single sentence. In recent months, Russia's losses at the front have exceeded the number of soldiers it can mobilize. By Kapustin's reading, the meaning is plain. The contract soldier model is exhausted. In any other country, this picture would be reason enough for the leadership to consider ending the war. Putin, though, believes everything can be fixed as long as the war goes on. Which leaves exactly one solution, and everyone knows what it is. If people won't go to war for money, they will be mobilized. That is why, in Kapustin's words, Russian society is now living in expectation of an approaching catastrophe. A new wave of total mobilization, one that will hit the big cities too, is at the door. And by many experts' reckoning, that wave could be declared this very autumn, right after the State Duma elections. We'll unpack step by step why this wave is not a rescue for Putin, but the fuse of a revolt. At the other end of this rupture sits the front itself. What truly shakes the regime isn't only that new soldiers can't be found, it's that the soldiers it already has no longer see a reason to be there. A Russian soldier, ordered to collect the surrender leaflets Ukraine had dropped before his comrades could see them, looks into the camera and speaks.
Our fucking command is fucked up. It sent us to collect these leaflets. This is how we are fighting. Our command is fucked up and our assignments are fucked up in this life. There's nothing good here, and there's no reason to be here.
On one side, a state that cannot find people to fight. On the other, an army that cannot find a reason to fight. Two ends of the same collapse. So what is the political bill for all this? Political scientist Abbas Galiamov's answer is ice cold. By his reading, everyone remembers that a mobilization has already happened, and everyone instantly understands that a new wave will go exactly where the last one went, to the same death.
The news that Russia fights with cannon fodder, it is kind of common knowledge. Well, that is, after this, the authorities will be absolutely illegitimate, absolutely simply hated.
Nor is this the exaggeration of some distant dissident. Russian journalist Dmitry Borisenko is openly calling on camera for the resignation of Putin and the State Duma. In his view,
this is a path that has repeatedly led to horrific civil conflicts. If the current authorities do not want to lead the country into a bloody civil conflict, then they should find the courage to resign.
it is the only way left to prevent a civil war and the collapse of Russia. So here is the picture standing in front of us. A regime that cannot raise its soldiers with money has therefore started taking them off the street, and by doing precisely that, is lighting a fuse it will not be able to put out. How did this fuse get here in the first place? Let's start by looking at a military recruitment office in an ordinary rural town in Siberia. Large propaganda posters reflecting the army's grandeur hang on the walls. The official sitting at the desk has been waiting for hours for a single volunteer to walk through the door. In years past, joining the army was seen as a rational choice for securing a steady income in these regions plagued by high unemployment. Today, however, only a deep sense of stagnation prevails within those buildings. This picture of isolation is repeated not just in this one town, but in thousands of settlements stretching from the Ural Mountains to the western borders. The glowing victory reports presented by the state's official media lose their credibility in the face of the cold reality created by the sealed coffins returning from the front lines to the villages. This situation shatters the illusion of military victory in the minds of the civilian population, building a silent yet powerful wall of civilian resistance. Society is directly experiencing the heavy toll of war through the absence of their own relatives, neighbors, and friends. The young population roaming the town streets has visibly dwindled. Some have already been sent to the front, while others have chosen to work in the underground economy to evade the draft. The answer to why people no longer walk through those doors as they once did lies in the cold reality created by the sealed coffins returning from the front lines to the villages. The state apparatus is turning to the power of money in an attempt to break this silent resistance in the streets. The signing bonuses offered in persuasion rooms have been raised over time to astronomical levels, such as $22,000. This sum, which a family living in a rural area could not save up even after years of work, was initially perceived as a magic formula to unclog the system. However, the reality on the ground reveals that money has lost its purchasing power in the face of the risk of death. As money's motivational power erodes, regional administrations are depleting their own civil infrastructure funds to make these payments, and the system is being devastated from within. This building wasn't always this quiet. In regions of high unemployment, signing up was a rational choice, a steady income. Today, that logic has broken. And understanding why is the key to the entire crisis. The contract model's wellspring was always the regions. Residents of the big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, were, in Kapustin's phrase, to put it mildly, unwilling to go to war. The state tried to buy its way past that unwillingness and pushed the bonuses to staggering levels. Depending on the region and the period, contract payments ranged from 200,000 to 4.5 million rubles. In last year's crisis months, some regions offered 2 to 4 million rubles. The numbers reached the point where the state began forgiving up to 10 million rubles, roughly $139,000, of debt for anyone signing a new contract. Past a certain point, though, money can no longer buy the risk of death. Kapustin sums up this wall in one sentence. If a man won't go for 2.5 million rubles, he certainly won't go for 1.5 million. Maybe he goes for 3 million, but that 3 million has to come from somewhere, and that money no longer exists. The economy is in an objective cash famine. To keep making these payments, the regions are draining their own civilian budgets, their road and school funds. So what came of it? The numbers confirm Kapustin word for word. By Verstka's reporting, the number of contract soldiers Moscow sent to the war fell by a third in the spring. 1,708 in April, 1,378 in May, a return to the 2024 levels that predate the million-ruble bonuses. Even the highest offers no longer work. And against this drying pool, how many soldiers does the front swallow? Here is the crisis's real arithmetic. MediaZona and the BBC's Russian service have verified, by name, unit and date of death, that 225,019 Russian soldiers have been killed, a list that includes 7,226 commissioned officers. Calculations run through inheritance and notary records push the true death toll toward the 350,000 mark. Add those too badly wounded to ever fight again, and the personnel pulled out of the front is estimated to be nearing the 1 million line. Now put two numbers side by side. The army is losing an average of 35,000 personnel a month to death, wounds, and other causes. The equivalent of a fully equipped battalion wiped off the map nearly every single day. Against that, the number of new contract soldiers entering the system is stuck at around 27,000 a month. The 8,000-man gap in between functions as an operational black hole that grows every 30 days and cannot be filled. Independent economist Janis Kluger's data shows this is no passing dip, but a durable trend. In the first quarter of 2026, the contract rate fell 20% year-on-year, down to its lowest level in 3 years. A signing tempo that once ran at 1,000 to 1,200 a day has dropped to 800. Over the same period, contracts signed fell from roughly 90,000 last year to about 71,000 this year. The prison quotas brought in to refill the emptying volunteer pool are running dry as well. By Russian officials' own figures, the inmate population has fallen from 456,000 in 2021 to 282,000, in part because a share of them was sent straight to the front. And while that strategy preserved the headcount for a while, it wrecked the quality. It produced the human material that soldiers in the field describe as unable to fight, as single use. The whole picture converges on one conclusion. Once losses exceed intake, the pool is underwater. And once money can no longer refill that pool, the contract era is over, mathematically. So what does an army do when it can't find soldiers for money? Military logic gives a single answer: mobilization. When you can't persuade people, you compel them. Yet Putin will not utter the word. Softer concepts are preferred instead: expanding contract recruitment. And that avoidance proves the problem is no simple matter of gathering troops. Beneath that timidity lies the trauma of autumn 2022. The partial mobilization declared that day, 300,000 reservists, shook the bond of loyalty between society and state to its root. Hundreds of thousands of people who refused to go to war flooded the border crossings. Car queues lasting days formed in the mountain passes of Georgia, on the Kazakh steppe, at the Finnish customs posts. Most of those who left the country were exactly the educated class its development depends on. The regime rode out that storm once. By analysts' reading, though, a second wave would provoke a far larger backlash today. War fatigue has deepened, and the Kremlin has still failed to explain to much of its public why this war is necessary at all. And this is where the timing locks shut. The State Duma elections come in September. A mobilization wave hitting the big cities could detonate on the very eve of those elections, at the regime's most fragile moment.
Вообще похеру. Вы не на того напали. Рассказывать мне, блядь, описывать.
Russia's elites have begun turning on Putin, admitting out loud that the war is lost. And the whispers in the Kremlin's corridors are now giving way to open betrayal against him. While what this war has brought Moscow shakes the deepest foundations of Russian society from within. On July 2nd, State Duma Committee Chair Nina Ostanina accused Putin's government, in remarks posted to Telegram, of hiding the truth from the public. In a dictatorship where opposition is silenced instantly and a single voice is the law, a figure from the highest level of parliament standing up and accusing her own cabinet of lying is no ordinary political criticism. In the order Putin built, this amounts to betrayal. It is an open flag of mutiny from elites who have begun abandoning a sinking ship. Ostanina compressed the abyss the regime is sliding toward into one lethal sentence. The country could be left without bread. Under sanctions, that is the equivalent of death. There is a single word in Russian history that has toppled empires, brought down crowns, and put czars in front of firing squads: bread. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 didn't begin with grand political manifestos. It began with the cries of the hungry, furious working class standing in bread queues on the streets of Petrograd. Today, a full 107 years later, the footsteps of that same nightmare echo through the cold, gilded corridors of the Kremlin. The war has stopped being an abstract red arrow on a map. It has come down directly into the kitchen of the Russian working class, into their wallets, and all the way to Putin's chair. So why have the regime's elites suddenly started abandoning ship and turning the bill on one another? They know exactly what the scent of betrayal is, the sound of an approaching popular revolt. This admission shows that the war has left the distant Frontline headline behind and reached the supermarket shelf and the bank queue. We'll trace how far this admission reaches, from the pump to the harvest, from the harvest to the bank, and on to the ballot box. But first, a small request. The algorithm has been suppressing independent analysis like this, and the video isn't reaching the people it should. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments helps us break through it. It takes seconds. Now let's look at exactly what that admission contained. Ostanina's warning is not an angry outburst thrown out before an election. It is a concrete alarm. By her account, nearly a third of Russia's largest refineries are out of action. The Deputy Prime Minister and the ministers responsible aren't describing the situation honestly, and no emergency plan exists. Putin, meanwhile, waves the same crisis away in public as not critical. So while the Kremlin transmits the message that there is no problem, the regime's own lawmaker declares that same picture a disaster. It matters to grasp that this is no ordinary opposition salvo. Duma elections come in September, and Ostanina openly hinted that this fuel and bread problem could cost certain officials their seats. The crisis has stopped being purely economic and turned into a direct political threat. What we're seeing is anger that has been building for months finally surfacing. Russian lawmakers are wrestling with the complaints coming out of their districts: expensive bread, empty filling stations, late wages. In a single-voiced system like Russia's, this is a turning point. A committee chair is openly accusing the government of concealing the truth. The crack is deep, and the pressure is far greater than assumed. In short, the one uttering the word defeat is no longer an enemy. It is the system's own voice. Ostanina isn't the only one raising it. Even the man at the very top of the Duma, Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin, stepped in with a public appeal.
If we unite everyone's will into a single will, we will prevail. We all understand that the collective West is against us. We must proceed on that basis and not give them any excuse, or let them look for one. We'll handle the problems at gas stations, just as we've handled other problems. They wanted to bring down our financial system. They failed.
He went further still, boasting that the West tried to bring down both the financial system and the economy, and failed. Reality says the opposite. In the very days those words were spoken, refineries were falling offline one by one, petrol was being rationed, and the banks were being quietly dragged toward a devastating threshold. So the boast that they couldn't break us hangs in the air in the shadow of the very breakdown it denies. The answer lies in the harvest fields. July is the very heart of Russia's harvest. This year, though, farmers can't find diesel, and the price of fuel has doubled. With no diesel to run the tractor, the grain stays in the field, and even once it's cut, moving it to the mill takes a truck, which takes fuel again. Fuel sits in every link of the chain. Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, better known as Magyar, sums the picture up in one line. The harvest across southern Russia is being crushed under a severe fuel crisis, and the rising price of diesel has made even hauling the grain uneconomical. Scarcity travels fast from there down to the dinner table. By independent accounts, the 2026 harvest is already 1 to 2 weeks behind. Food producers are warning retailers about delivery delays. Hauliers raised freight rates by at least 10% from July 1st, and every marked-up truck eventually lands on the shelf price. And once the price of bread starts moving in a country, the matter stops being economic and becomes social, which is precisely why the Kremlin is treading so carefully. This is exactly the domino Ostanina meant when she said, death. The quietest front of this economic siege opens not in the street, but at the very heart of the financial system, since the admission didn't come from the Duma alone. The same fear was voiced by the head of Russia's largest bank. Here the story moves from the stomach to the wallet. Sberbank CEO German Gref said on state television on June 30th that there is no one left in this country whose greatest wish isn't for the war to end as soon as possible. The American press ran it under the headline that Putin's top banker is begging for the war to end. Sberbank's chief didn't stop there. Calling the central bank's rate policy all but irrational, he said the economy has been overcooled and could even contract in 2026. That warning, though, is only the first signal of a far darker picture. Even Kremlin-linked economists now speak of a banking crisis threshold that has been crossed. By CMASF, that threshold is defined two ways: problem assets exceeding 10% or a mass flight of deposits. Yet by the end of 2025, 11% of corporate loans, a sum topping 10 trillion rubles, were already problematic, and among small firms, the share climbed to 19%. Households are in the same swamp. Non-performing personal debt has passed $30 billion. The Institute, which for now rates the odds of a crisis as moderate, points to autumn 2026 as the genuinely dangerous window. And the institution saying all this is no bystander. Sberbank is the backbone of Russian finance and one of the banks closest to the state. Its chief calling for an end to the war on state television shows, all by itself, how far the unease inside the regime now runs. Sberbank also recently cut its corporate lending outlook. As bad debts pile up, the bank is turning cautious about issuing new credit, which means a fresh, vicious circle. Tighter credit strained companies generate more bad debt, and that makes the bank warier still. From a distance, all these numbers can look like a problem for bankers and bureaucrats alone. The real question is this: what does this picture amount to in an ordinary Russian's life? By analysts' reading, the most striking place to look is the budget. Russia borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars at crushing rates to finance the war. Today, servicing the interest alone costs more than the country's entire health budget and runs to nearly 1.5 times what it spends on education. Put differently, every interest payment now competes directly with a hospital, a school, a pension. Faced with that choice, the Kremlin always picks the same side: the front, not the people. Which is why the war has reached the Russian family's dinner table. People know it now not from the news, but from their own kitchens. For 4 years, Putin sold this war to the Russian people as an epic of victory. Maps on the screens, anthems, cries of triumph. Now those same screens are discussing something else entirely: the forced evacuation of Russia's own border cities. The person proposing it isn't an opposition figure. It's the Kremlin's loudest voice, Vladimir Solovyov. On a broadcast last Sunday evening, watched by millions, he said the people living along the border should be moved thousands of kilometers into the country's interior.
We're talking about 200,000 to 300,000 people living in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Kursk and Bryansk regions. They are, de facto, living on the front lines. What's stopping us from setting aside the acronym PVR and simply recognizing that we have regions that provide support? What's stopping us from taking these people in, giving them the opportunity to relocate and live a normal life in a new place? The Far East Hectare.
And no state gets to say, "We're winning," while discussing pulling its own citizens deeper inside its own territory. 4 years of victory narrative collapsed in that single sentence. What's more, this isn't the first time. In Kursk, in Bryansk, in Belgorod, hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens have already left their homes. But the scale being discussed on those screens today is many times larger. The reason is simple. Ukraine has taken the upper hand in this war. And Putin, far from winning, can no longer protect the towns inside his own border. The dark plan that would force millions into evacuation, we're about to break it down, step by step. But first, a small request. Independent war and geopolitics analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video isn't reaching many of the people who'd be interested. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. Now, let's go back to that broadcast. The setting is one of Russia's most watched political programs, Sunday evening on Rossiya 1. And the evacuation proposal wasn't the first thing he said. Before it, Solovyov issued a far darker warning. In his view, Ukraine will no longer settle for strikes on the oil and gas sector and on transport infrastructure. His sentence was blunt.
That is precisely why they are targeting transportation infrastructure. It's clear that as winter approaches, there will be an attack on energy infrastructure. But that's obvious, so we need to take preventative measures right now. In particular, one of the most effective measures is to push the enemy as far back as possible. To this end, we must provide our army with everything it needs to launch strikes deep into enemy territory. For example, the situation in the city of Energodar is extremely dire.
That sequence is the key to this entire video. The solution Solovyov actually wants is military. The idea of moving people only arrives where that solution has failed to materialize. The picture then grew heavier. He described an extremely dire situation in the city of Energodar in occupied Zaporizhia and along the entire line of contact. So the problem isn't confined to Russia's own border strip. The same condition holds across the whole front it controls. And then came the justification. By Solovyov's account, a 40-kilometer death zone has formed along the border, and civilians can no longer remain inside it. That statement is a far bigger admission than it appears, since a state broadcaster is conceding that a strip under his own country's control is no longer livable. It amounts to declaring that a country has effectively erased a region from its own map. Then came the numbers. Between 200,000 and 400,000 people living in the Kursk and Bryansk regions and in the occupied parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. By his own description, these people are effectively living on the front line. And note this, that figure covers only the strip closest to the border. In the Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions immediately behind it, millions of people live. So, if Solovyov's own warning comes true, and the energy infrastructure collapses over winter, the population under threat of displacement won't stay in the hundreds of thousands, it will reach millions. His proposal was this: let's evacuate these people, give them the chance to build a normal life somewhere new. And he named 3 destinations: the state's Far Eastern Hectare program, the Urals, and the Volga region. Let's distribute them across the country, he said. Then he immediately added, but we don't abandon our own people. When the front line pulls back, we'll rebuild, and people will return to their homes. The order of those sentences tells you everything. First, it can't be lived in. Then immediately, but we're not abandoning it. That's less a plan than an attempt to soften a truth that can't be accepted. He tries to take back the weight of what he said the moment he says it. So why does it matter so much who said this? Solovyov is no ordinary host. He is the most visible face of Russian state television, for years the harshest defender of the Kremlin line, and a man whose closeness to Putin goes back decades. The sentences he builds on screen often function as a signal that arrives before official statements do, which is why "let's empty the border regions" carries an entirely different weight coming from that mouth rather than from an opposition channel. To see the true weight of this appeal, you have to remember what the same man has been saying for years. Solovyov spent years enthusiastically advocating the destruction of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Ukrainians left in the dark, left without heat, was presented on those screens as an objective. Now, the same voice is telling his own audience they may go without heat this winter. And this isn't merely a rhetorical irony, there's a measured reality behind it. By the report of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, Russian forces struck Ukraine's energy infrastructure almost daily in January 2026. 5 of those were large-scale attacks hitting multiple regions at once. Key components of the energy system were damaged or destroyed in at least 17 regions and in Kyiv. Millions of people had access to electricity for only a few hours a day throughout the month. Heating and water services were disrupted as well. The human consequence was measured too. By the International Organization for Migration, roughly 325,000 Ukrainians who had returned home, are at risk of being displaced again because of the energy crisis, which is exactly why something needs stating plainly in the middle of this. A family sitting in the dark is not a statistic, on whichever side it happens to be. The Ukrainians who have lived through 4 winters without heat, and the Russians whose homes along the border are now being discussed for evacuation, are both civilians paying the bill for the same war. Shrinking one side's suffering to justify the other's is the worst possible way to tell this story. The political meaning is plain enough as well. What the Kremlin spent years narrating as "what we're doing to them" is now being narrated as "what could happen to us." And when a propaganda machine starts frightening its own audience, the narrative has already slipped its handlers. It's also worth understanding why winter is so critical for Russia. Most Russian cities are heated by district heating systems. A single plant feeds the hot water and radiators of an entire neighborhood or district. The system is efficient, yet extremely fragile, since when one node goes down, there is no alternative. At -20 degrees, even a few hours of interruption can freeze the pipes and cause permanent damage. That is precisely the threat Solovyov means when he says, "Winter is coming." And the reason to take it seriously is that Russian energy and refinery infrastructure has already been under continuous attack in recent months. So the scenario being discussed on air isn't a purely hypothetical fear. It's the winter extension of a campaign that has already begun. So why does the phrase 40-kilometer death zone matter so much? Since in conventional war, a front is a line. Battle in front of it, life behind it. Soldiers fight at the front, resupply happens a few kilometers back, and 30 kilometers behind that sit the hospital, the depot, and the headquarters. That rear zone is where an army breathes. Drone warfare destroyed that geometry. Cheap systems flying in swarms and transmitting real-time imagery have made the safe strip behind the front dangerous to a depth of 40 kilometers. Now the supply truck, the repair shop, and a civilian grocery store all carry the same risk. And this isn't only a military problem. When a 30 to 40 kilometer strip effectively becomes unlivable, the towns, fields, factories, and schools within it lose their function too. People cannot stay there. Those who do cannot live a normal life. The lives of those who remain are a portrait in themselves. The farmer who can't reach the field at harvest, the shopkeeper who can't deliver an order, the medical team that can't reach a patient. A region empties economically first and physically second. What's more, that depth keeps growing. At the end of April, Ukrainian drones struck Yekaterinburg, more than 1,800 kilometers from the border. The city's airport has been shut down repeatedly since. That carries a symbolic weight for Russia. For centuries, the phrase "beyond the Urals" meant one thing in the Russian mind: the place safe from foreign invasion. When Napoleon attacked in 1812 and Nazi Germany in 1941, moving civilians and factories beyond those mountains was enough. Now, Solovyov is pointing to the same addresses. Yet this time, that ground has become contestable too. When a country points to the farthest corner of its own geography as a refuge, it no longer has such a thing as defensive depth. Underneath this shift lies simple economics. The defending side has to use expensive systems and a limited stock of munitions to stop every incoming craft. The attacking side can press the same line with far cheaper craft in far greater numbers. And protecting thousands of kilometers of a country's depth evenly is impossible. The result? Air defense concentrates on the most critical points, and everything else stays relatively open. The logic that makes a 40-kilometer strip unlivable is the same logic that shuts down an airport 1,800 kilometers away. A ferocious riot has broken out on the streets of Russia. Ukraine's drone strikes on Russian refineries have dragged the country into a fuel shortage unseen since the final years of the Soviet Union, and that shortage has turned gas stations into battlegrounds.
What the fuck? Did I lie to you or something?
To some observers,
Get the fuck
this
outta
is a
here,
mass
you
eruption of
bastard.
anger that has cornered the Kremlin and could mark a turning point in the war. The queues have become boxing rings. Ordinary people are coming to blows over a single tank of fuel, climbing onto cars in desperation and kicking them, pounding on the windows. Now, this is not a full-scale riot, nor is it a revolution, at least not yet. No, the tanks aren't in the streets, the palace hasn't been stormed. But in the plainest dictionary sense of the word, this is a riot. More and more Russians are beginning to take what they believe they're owed by force, both from those who govern them and from each other. Because there's no other way to get it. And this anger isn't in one city, it's erupting everywhere. Different cities, the same scene, fights in the queue, shoving and scuffling, right in the middle of a state narrative that keeps insisting everything is under control. But what you just saw is only the street-level face of a collapse. Because it's no longer just about fighting. The tanks of parked cars are being drilled and siphoned, fuel trucks are being stopped on the road, and in some places a tanker is being taken hostage. We'll see each of these in a moment, but the picture already emerging is this. All of Russian society is beginning to unravel. Where this anger could lead is written in Russia's own history. Because in 1917, what tore the Russian people away from the regime wasn't only military defeat at the front. Hunger, a transport crisis, misrule, and the collapse of faith in state authority all converged at the same point. Today, technology makes that same process visible far faster. And when people are cornered into a place where they can only get what they need by force, this usually doesn't slow down. Absent a major state intervention, it only accelerates. This is creating a deep desperation in Russia, and that desperation, as people erupt in anger, is expressed in very concrete forms. But note, for now, this anger is not aimed at Vladimir Putin. It's aimed at the nearest target, the local authorities, the next driver in line. Today we'll talk about how an empire whose soil boils with oil has cornered its own people, and why this crack keeps widening on its own. But before we unpack why the crisis feeds itself and where winter could take Russia, a small favor. Independent war and economy analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd want it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that. Now let's get back to the head of the queue. Let's start with the scale of the crisis, because most people can't imagine how bad it is. Restrictions have now spread to almost the entire country. 78 of 83 regions have gone to rationing. Only 5 remain untouched. And by the Financial Times analysis, this crisis is directly hitting 50 million people, roughly a third of the population. To put it in the language of numbers, this means a colossal mass of 50 to 70 million people, nearly half the country's population, left alone with fuel shortages, queues, and mounting anger. And how deep a collapse this figure describes, you only need to hear from a Russian's own mouth. A man who set out to see for himself whether the crisis had really hit the country, freezes at what he finds.
All the oil refineries are destroyed, and how long will it take for them to be restored, for them to resume their work, oil refining in general, for them to get this gasoline and diesel fuel? How long it will take is unknown. So, terrible times like these lie ahead for us.
It has a counterpart in city after city on the map. In Putin's own hometown of St. Petersburg, fuel depots at the port are ablaze, while right beside them, the gasoline queue stretches for kilometers. A scene almost symbolic of the crisis. And this is no ordinary province. Moscow and St. Petersburg alone hold nearly a quarter of the country's population, Russia's 2 most privileged and most sheltered metropolises. The Kremlin's ability, for 4 years, to make the war look like something happening far away to someone else depended precisely on protecting this shop window. Now the glass of that window is cracking. The form of the rationing varies by place too. In some regions, odd even days by license plate. In others, a limited number of liters per vehicle. In Belgorod, acting Governor Shuvayev announced he was lowering the purchase cap to 30 liters and warned openly, "This is only the beginning." In the southern towns of Kaliningrad, fuel tankers haven't been able to get through for a week and a half. Even the buses have ground to a halt, and diesel has climbed to 159 rubles a litre. Kaliningrad too is no ordinary region, an exclave surrounded by NATO countries and cut off from the Russian mainland, Moscow's forward outpost on the Baltic. For a place this strategic to run dry, shows the crisis touches not only the economy, but a security question as well. Analyst McGlynn's line sums up the picture. For 4 years, Russians in big cities could treat this war as something that happens to someone else. The gasoline queue ended that. And this desperation is spilling out in ugly forms. In Crimea, the situation is harshest. From June 21st, all sales to individuals and businesses were halted. According to regional leader Aksionov, fuel was reserved only for state services that keep the republic running and secure. In practice, this means gasoline is cut off from civilians and reserved for the army, the municipality, and those close to power. On June 26th, a state of emergency was declared, coupons were suspended, the tourist season was pushed to September, and a 100-litre per vehicle limit was imposed on crossing the Kerch Bridge. A shared line from a Crimea resident sums up the siege.
No ferry, no bridge, no fuel, no bus, no plane, no train, and Moscow is silent.
Crimea being hit this hard is no coincidence either. An annexed symbol, the base of the Black Sea Fleet, one of Moscow's most sensitive spots. For the civilian life of such a strategic place to effectively stop multiplies the political weight of the crisis. And those left without fuel aren't meeting this with passive resignation. The logic of the anger can be summed up in a single sentence. If I can't have it, neither can you. This desperation is fraying people's nerves too. In Stavropol, a driver whose tank has run completely dry screams, driven half mad, "I'm running on fumes just to find this damn gasoline." And the fighting isn't aimed only upward at the elites. It's aimed at the person waiting right alongside them. Footage of drivers slashing tires, smashing windows, and going at each other in the queues is growing more frequent. The anger looks for an outlet and most often finds the nearest human being. And this isn't an isolated outburst, but a pattern. According to RFE/RL, videos showing fights breaking out in hours-long queues are being shared one after another on social media. Different cities, the same scene. Even after weeks pass, the picture doesn't change. The brawl in the queue has become the crisis's new normal. And when desperation crosses a threshold, people no longer just wait in line. They start to hunt. The first new profession the crisis spawned was fuel piracy. Those who drill into parked cars' tanks and siphon out the fuel resell it on the black market at many times the price. It spread so widely that in the hardest-hit regions, leaving a car unattended now means risking finding its tank drained. But it didn't stop at parked cars. The hopelessness of finding fuel drove drivers straight after the source. The moment some spot a fuel tanker, they latch on and follow it all the way to the station. And this fuel hunt has grown steadily more aggressive. When following isn't enough, footage on social media claims desperate crowds are stopping trucks on the road and hijacking them. At the far extreme is an almost unthinkable scene. Drivers in Novorossiysk, unable to fill their tanks for a week, effectively took a fuel tanker hostage. A city taking a fuel truck hostage reads less like a crime report now than a bulletin of collapse. Even the queue itself has turned into a marketplace for fraud. In reported cases, some pose as police officers to jump the line, while others sell their spot in the queue for money. According to relayed accounts, all of this has spread across at least 80 regions of Russia and Crimea, and these scenes share a single meaning. Scarcity is draining not only tanks, but the unwritten rules that hold people together. When a society begins to see its neighbor's tank as prey, what's unraveling is no longer merely the fuel supply. Another response to the crisis is perhaps the most Russian of all. Those sitting on the sidelines realize that someone else's trouble is an opportunity for them. According to NPR and AP, some speculators in Crimea are selling fuel at twice the market price. The methods are simple. Some siphon gasoline from the car of a person who waited for hours to fill up, then sell it on the black market, at a markup, to someone with no intention of waiting. Just as in any business, here too people chase efficiency. One person's hours-long ordeal is reduced to a few minutes profit opportunity for another. There are more advanced versions too. Some drivers have modified their vehicles to look like they're filling a normal tank, while actually filling hidden jerrycans to sell. In under a month, a brand new profession has emerged. Ways to make money by stealing from your neighbor. How solidarity is dissolving is laid bare by a shared comment from a Muscovite. He complains that soldiers are dying at the front while he wastes time in a queue, proposes as a solution that, "We should be given free gasoline," and adds, "Everyone outside Moscow and St. Petersburg can go to hell." So the crisis is consuming not just fuel, but the feeling of us. The center writes off the periphery, the driver the next in line, the neighbor the neighbor. This is no surprise for Russia. It's actually a small-scale rerun of how the country's richest men, the oligarchs, built their power. As the Soviet Union collapsed, those who grasped how the system worked seized state assets, meant to be shared equally with the people, for a pittance. Those men knew they were wrecking their own society but didn't care. Their only concern was their own wealth. Today's small-scale rerun at the edge of the queue carries the same morality. This instinct is also a clue to why Russia still lags behind many modern countries. When short-term individual gain overrides the common good, society weakens. A quick break. Liking, a one-word comment, and subscribing directly help this video reach far more people. Because now we turn to how the state is trying to put out this fire, and why this time its water has run out. So what is the state doing? The classic move, passing the problem to the next guy. Putin admitted the crisis. Problems persist for drivers and businesses. Finding the right grade of gasoline isn't always easy, he said. But he immediately added, not critical, temporary. When a leader who sweeps everything under the rug so much as names a problem, it's usually a sign of how big that problem is. And the authorities' method for calming the tension in the queues is chilling. To push more product onto the market, they lowered the standard. Euro 3 gasoline was permitted instead of Euro 5 through the end of the year. The result shows up in mechanics' videos. Low-quality fuel is damaging engines. Russian auto services have begun recording a sharp rise in requests from drivers reporting breakdowns after filling up with low-quality gasoline. Expensive repairs to fuel systems and engines are on the way. So in the short term, the pressure eases a little. In the long term, the damage grows. And this time, the bill is paid directly by the driver. This is a classic pattern. Muffling the complaint in the short term at the cost of creating a bigger problem for yourself in the long term. Throughout the war, this was Putin's answer to nearly every problem, thinking about the lifespan of his own rule, not of society. Russia has shut its doors too. Gasoline and jet fuel exports are banned through the end of July. A diesel ban is on the table. It's trying to close the gap with imports from Belarus and India. Halting its own exports is itself an admission. One of the world's largest fuel sellers is now struggling to find enough gasoline for its own citizens. But the real issue is that this time the old cards are used up. Something similar happened last year, and Moscow used nearly every tool it had to recover. Last time's recipe, dumping the shortfall on neighboring countries, isn't working now. That capacity has already been maxed out for months. The root problem is this. Ukraine is getting better and better at hitting Russian refineries. By some assessments, this drone campaign has knocked out roughly 30% of Russia's refining capacity. The numbers show it most clearly. According to Reuters, the refinery in the capital probably can't be repaired until 2027. 80% of the country's largest refinery's capacity is offline, with no estimate even for when it will recover. The damage is now cumulative. Each new daily blow lands on top of older ones left unrepaired. This is exactly why the crisis erupted so fast. The refinery network was already loaded with accumulated damage, and demand could only be met through the summer. When summer came and consumption peaked, Ukraine launched its biggest wave of strikes, and everything jammed at once. On top of that, there aren't enough spare parts or technical staff to bring these plants back quickly. The China option is a trap in itself. Russia has to sell crude to China cheap and buy the same product back refined at a high price, losing on both transactions. And the infrastructure doesn't even allow Russia to import all its needs from China. Still, let's not paint the picture in one color. By the industry expectation Reuters reports, supply may ease somewhat toward the end of July. And the real bad news is hidden in winter. Because the crisis is biting its own tail. Scarcity leads to chaos, chaos to more scarcity. Every small act of desperation degrades supply a little more, and degraded supply breeds new desperation. By this video's core thesis, this is a trap. It doesn't fix itself, and the state's resources are limited too. Beneath this lies something deeper, the dissolving of the invisible glue that holds a society together. Modern societies hold us together less through written laws than through unwritten rules. Trust in the next person in line, the expectation that everyone will go to their job. When those rules erode, so does trust. An every man for himself mood spreads. Modern life rests on invisible systems most of us can't even name, and these systems are so interdependent that when one falters, the effect quickly spills to the others. At this point, one has to understand a quiet bargain unique to Russia. In the post-Soviet era, there was an unwritten agreement between society and the state. The people largely gave up political freedoms. In return, the state guaranteed stability, order, and the uninterrupted flow of basic necessities. It was a, "you don't meddle with us, and we'll provide your welfare" deal. But when one of the world's largest oil producers becomes unable to give its own citizens gasoline, it has broken its half of that bargain. This is where the real seed of the revolt lies. Today, the anger flows horizontally. Driver at the next driver, citizen at the local governor. But history shows this anger can turn vertical at a threshold. That is, it can shift its target from a local official straight to the top of power. That threshold is the moment people say, "This isn't a temporary hiccup, the system itself is collapsing." And once that sentence spreads, it's almost impossible to take back. Russia's own past is full of this lesson. In both 1917 and 1991, what toppled the regimes wasn't only armies or ideologies, it was the state becoming unable to provide the simplest things: bread, heating, transport. Empires often begin to unravel, not with a heroic moment in the squares, but with an empty shelf in a store, with gasoline running out at a station. Because people trust not a state's power, but its function. And when that function stops, fear slowly gives way to anger. That's why the real breaking point is not the price at the pump or the length of the queue. The real breaking point is that quiet social contract cracking, for the first time, in front of such a vast audience. And once trust is shaken, it is the hardest, most expensive thing for a state to rebuild. The classic question of post-apocalyptic stories comes true here as well. What happens when a society is left desperate? The answer is no longer fiction. It's being watched live in Russia. But the real test will come in winter. The refineries, running at their last strength through the summer, may not find the time to make the safe switch to winter fuel formulas, meaning that even as the season changes, the shortage may not end. Worse, if farm machinery can't find enough diesel, the harvest is at risk, and a fuelless society can turn into a hungry and cold one. The economic ground is already cracking too. Inflation rose to 6% at the end of June. The 2026 growth forecast was cut to 0.4%, and according to Gallup, 60% of Russians say economic conditions are worsening, a record in 20 years of the survey. And let's not move on without asking this. If Russians who have only been without fuel for a month are already turning their backs on their government, what happens 6 months from now when they're genuinely cold and hungry? The source of the inflation is twofold as well: money printing on one side and expensive fuel pushing up the price tag of every product on the other. A society can't stay standing when a few legs of the stool it sits on break, and once shaken, restoring this balance is far harder than knocking it over. And this is the moment people truly realize a society has seriously broken down, when what they can find in the stores comes down to cheap grains. This awareness is already showing on people's faces. In footage shared from Stavropol, a woman says that even though they live in the 21st century, they can neither keep their businesses running nor put gasoline in their cars. The disbelief in her voice more striking than the anger. Experts don't expect a famine, but reaching products like eggs or fresh vegetables at all times, at any price, could become harder. Besides, these economic troubles were there before the crisis too. The fuel shortage isn't creating them, it's magnifying all of them at once. The Russian economy was already on a knife's edge on many fronts, and fuel is sharpening that knife a little more. Even from within the elite there are cracks. Sberbank's boss Gref said there's no longer anyone in the country whose primary concern isn't for the military hostilities to end as soon as possible. So how seriously should we take this whole picture? Here, honesty is essential. Carnegie's Sergei Vakulenko issues an important caveat. the scope of the current shortage is still smaller than the crisis at the end of 2025. Set aside the severe situation in Crimea, and the picture isn't all that bad, he says. And he sums up what's driving the direction of the crisis in a single sentence. The amount of gasoline in Russia is actually the result of a race between Ukraine's drones and Russia's repair crews. The meaning of that race is simple. As Ukraine hits new refineries, the shortage deepens, and as Russian crews repair them, it eases. So the crisis keeps swinging between the next drone wave and the next repair, neither fully collapsing nor fully recovering. It's possible the picture gets worse than we can imagine, and also possible there's an unexpected recovery. The same honesty applies to the word riot. What's happening today is not a revolution, and the anger hasn't yet reached Putin. Moreover, for years many have said, Russians are docile, they won't rise up no matter what. Yet Russia, in the last century alone, showed the opposite several times. So it would also be wrong to dismiss this discontent entirely. The accurate reading is to see today's events not as the end of the regime, but as a crack where the unwritten rules are beginning to dissolve. And one last balance, because there are two sides to the coin. This crisis is triggered by Ukraine's refinery campaign, but its price is paid by ordinary Russians waiting in the queue. Just as, in the cities Russia strikes, the price is paid by ordinary Ukrainians. In the end, this isn't a story of victory or defeat. It's the story of ordinary people who pay the heaviest bill of the war on both sides of the front. And the real signal to watch is not the fighting at the gas stations. It's whether the anger shifts from local officials toward the Kremlin. The day that threshold is crossed, this turns into an entirely different story. So do you think this is the beginning of a revolt? Or just another winter Russians will grit their teeth and endure, as they have for years? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's exclusive war and economy analyses, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us. As Anton Barbashin of Riddle Russia points out, Kremlin planners are worried about precisely that, a mobilization's effect on the September vote. But if the regime is this afraid, why is it already taking men by force? The answer is in the street. The Kremlin has, in effect, already begun the mobilization, without ever pronouncing the word. The raid footage you watched in the opening has a date and an address. June 17th to 18th, the Penza region. Masked men, black vans waiting outside liquor stores at night, public transport stopped and emptied. By local accounts, the officials were picking out men who could be easily made to sign. And here is the most critical part. The Penza military commissar later personally confirmed that the raids took place. Officials confined themselves to declaring only the forced signing reports baseless, which means the operation itself is now on the official record. Who is being targeted? By what the partisan group Atesh relayed on June 22nd, the Kremlin has imposed strict quotas on the regions, and local administrations failing to meet them have set the enlistment offices loose. The hardest hit are the most defenseless, men with heavy debts in the enforcement registers, ex-convicts on probation, migrants, and newly naturalized citizens. That this is no isolated provincial episode was confirmed by a voice from inside the system itself. State Duma deputy Andrei Gurulyov wrote on his Telegram channel on June 1st that the Kremlin was preparing a new mobilization for the autumn, since the front had reached an impasse. Shortly afterward, he claimed his channel had been stolen and that enemies were spreading texts from it. Now to the truly critical connection. When a regime hits this kind of dead end, it starts looking for a way out. And Moscow suddenly beginning to talk of peace is exactly that search. By British political scientist Mark Galeotti's assessment in The Times, the Kremlin keeps hinting it is ready for peace talks, on Moscow's own terms, but ready. Last month, Putin even claimed Ukraine had proposed a mutual moratorium on long-range strikes and that he had turned it down. Some Russian government commentators, though, showed an unusual reticence toward the very idea of such a mutual halt. And Moscow speaks more and more of bringing in China or Brazil as mediators and opening new talks with Ukraine. These whispers shouldn't be taken lightly. A side beginning to speak of the table is, in itself, an admission of weakness. The other face of the coin stays fixed, though. Moscow has not softened its public position and keeps issuing ultimatums, including the full withdrawal of Ukraine's defense forces from the Donbass. So what stands before us is a regime that whispers of peace and issues ultimatums in the same breath. A regime searching for the exit without being able to admit it. A quick break. Liking the video, leaving even a one-word comment and subscribing directly helps this analysis reach far more people, since we're now coming to what this manpower crisis turns into at the front, how the army is coming apart from the inside. This meltdown in manpower is not merely a numbers problem. It has shaken the training system behind the front to its foundations, and the effect has spread through the entire army. In the war's first phase, a newly enlisted civilian went through 3 months of comprehensive training before being sent to the line of fire. Mounting losses cut that to 1 month by 2024. Today, this vital phase is documented as having shrunk to a single week, in some cases to a superficial 5-day briefing. Consider the environment a private thrown into the field with a few days training actually meets. A sky full of drones, no night vision equipment, a few minutes of wrong movement enough to be fatal. In such an environment, the instinct to abandon the position at the first pressure outweighs any disciplined defense, and the unraveling is contagious. A fresh private who, on his first night at the front, hears how the previous unit dropped its weapons and scattered, will not fight bravely at that same spot. Untrained masses breaking at first contact open gaps in the defensive map the enemy can walk through, and every gap zeroes out unit cohesion a little further. We watched how this collapse turns into a battlefield catastrophe with startling clarity at Odradne. Military engineers had spent months building deep trenches, anti-tank ditches and minefields here. An engineering complex that looked impassable on paper for months fell within a few hours because of the untrained, demoralized garrison placed inside it. Deep State's assessment from the region of those who could flee FLED carries the quality of a confession, summarizing how much the army's will to fight has eroded. The fact that only 56 soldiers were lost on such a large defense line shows that units rapidly evacuated the front rather than fighting. This contagious panic experienced by inexperienced groups is evolving into a psychological root spreading to other trenches as well. This tendency toward uncontrolled dissolution on the battlefield is also locking the state's logistical and administrative structure into a vicious cycle. High casualty rates at the forward lines create sudden cadre shortages at the front. The command echelon dispatches untrained masses from collection centers in the rear to hot zones. These forces joining operations with insufficient equipment are disabled much faster at the first serious contact. This mechanism, where soldier quality drops a little more with each rotation, carries the burden of the few experienced commanders remaining on the ground to unbearable levels. The bill of all this reckless manpower consumption shakes the civilian economic indicators far behind the lines to their roots. In the first quarter of 2026, approximately 46% of the state budget was directed to military activities. The material dimension of the war is assessed to be running at around $660 million daily. Even the $22,000 incentives paid to the 27,000 people who can barely be added to the system each month create an extra financial burden of hundreds of millions of dollars. The strategic problem at hand is that the administration cannot find the sustainable operational force it expects on the ground in return, despite taking this fortune out of its coffers. These budgets are turning into a black hole, swallowing the country's resources rather than producing a solution. While the war economy takes the form of a vortex sucking all material resources, civilian industry is slowly consuming itself under this burden. The army is forcing technical specialists in technology-producing factories, heavy industry journeymen, and logistics managers to wear uniforms through indirect pressures to fill its shrinking pool. The placing of experienced engineers torn from factories as infantry in trenches after very short adaptation is bringing production processes inside the country to a standstill. While the civilian economy enters a general strangulation effect, the shortage of craftsmen who would repair military vehicles is slowing operational speed. This wasteful use of the human element is stopping the state's civilian engine from within. This blockage, where the deep personnel erosion at the front line and the qualified worker crisis inside the country converge, is trapping the administration in a long-term and risky strategic deadlock. Military literature points to the declaration of large-scale mobilization as the solution to the crisis. However, it is noticed that the leadership avoids using this word with great care. The preference for softer concepts such as expansion of contract recruitment proves that the problem is not merely a soldier collection operation. At the foundation of this cautious approach lies the heavy trauma created between society and the state by the partial mobilization implemented in the autumn of 2022. The decision announced from televisions that day had fundamentally shaken the public's bond of loyalty to the state. Hundreds of thousands of citizens who did not want to participate in the war had flooded border gates with an unprecedented wave of anxiety. The vehicle queues lasting weeks at passes in Georgia's mountains, Kazakhstan's steppes, and Finnish customs were the visual of civilian society's de facto objection to war policies. This educated class leaving the country resulted in the large-scale evaporation of the intellectual capital that would ensure national development. In an environment where the public's faith in security policies is this badly damaged, a new compulsory soldier collection move could lay the groundwork for a chaos wave difficult to control in the squares of major cities. This mutiny concern is condemning the administration to superficial solutions that save the day by preventing it from taking radical steps. The structure that cannot collect soldiers from its own streets turned its eyes to the manpower of its allies as another reflection of desperation. Information leaked about workers who are citizens of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan being tried to be drawn into army ranks using residence documents as pretexts is creating a major political reaction in these countries' capitals. These Asian republics whose security perceptions are shaken are shifting their courses toward China's orbit. A state carrying its internal demographic deadlock to foreign diplomacy is falling into a trapped position within the chess game it itself constructed by narrowing its sphere of influence. Finnish President Stubb's analytical insights reveal that the side conducting the offensive is trying to advance with a frightening casualty ratio of 1:8 compared to defenders. It is clear that a modern society cannot endure erosion at this level for decades. In the World War II years, Soviet armies had achieved massive continental victories, reaching different capitals within a few years while absorbing casualties. Today, while experiencing human losses at similar intensity, small towns are being brought under control after months of intense artillery bombardment. In a society where the population structure is aging and birth rates are weakening, replacing a generation lost at this scale in the short or medium term is an extraordinary problem. The disproportion between the demographic price paid and the pace of advancement on the map documents the human-centered unsustainability of the current strategy. The mechanism is consuming its future by burying the young generations that would ensure the country's long-term development in the ground for the sake of making changes on the front map. The administration cannot find technicians to manage production lines, even if it wants to revitalize weapons factories. Recruitment offices cannot find citizens to fill contract forms, even if they pour rubles. The bill of war is not being paid with depleting ammunition depots, but with the loss of human capital that will never return. The delusion of possessing inexhaustible massive armies has entered the process of collapse under the silence of empty registration offices and the weight of statistics coming from the front. Against 35,000 soldiers spent each month, the gap created by the number that can be collected with incentives raised to the point of depleting civilian budgets is swallowing the system's future. Astronomical bonuses, vital training squeezed into 1 week, and desperate moves directed abroad are breaking the structure's resilience rather than solving problems. Decision-makers who slow their own civilian economy but cannot even utter the general mobilization decision out of fear of a new flight wave or civilian reaction, stand at the center of a historic deadlock. Modern air defense systems or armored brigades may be technically superior. However, when no devoted and qualified humans remain to operate these systems on the ground, all those piles of metal become non-functional. Massive strategic visions are slowly heading toward the danger of shutdown within this lethal equation whose pool is drying up. So, what do you think about this topic? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on PPR Global's analysis, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us. A quick break. Independent analysis like this is suppressed by the algorithm too. Liking the video, leaving even a one-word comment, and subscribing directly help it reach far more people, since we're now coming to the part of this picture that has alarmed even Western intelligence. The devastating threshold the banks are being dragged toward. Now to the heart of the matter, and the ones sounding the alarm aren't only Russian economists, but Western intelligence. In early July, a European state's intelligence report described a banking crisis in Russia as a devastating risk. The reason fits into a single image. The Russian banking system is in the middle of a financial bypass operation. To fund the war, commercial banks were pushed into lending to the front. So the heart, the central bank, keeps pumping fresh money into the system, while the arteries, the banks themselves, are already clogged with loans that will never come back. Pressure comes from outside as well. The European Union's new sanctions wave is severing, one by one, the outside links of more than half of Russia's internationally connected banks. Normally, when a bank stumbles, the state rushes in. This time, the rescuer itself is short of cash, since the same drone campaign is cutting the oil revenue that keeps those banks standing. The state has had to reach into the National Reserve Fund and trim non-war spending. So the cushion that would catch a failing bank thins a little more each day. In economist Igor Lipsitz's phrase, this is only the visible tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is about to break apart. The most human and most dangerous face of this picture, though, lies in the ordinary depositor's reaction. By analysts' accounts, Russians have lately been pulling cash out of banks at record levels, since trust is gone. People now plainly sense that banks can fail. Nor can we call them wrong. Even a senior figure at one of the country's largest banks was able to say that the collapse of smaller banks outside the top 20 wouldn't be bad for Russia. Yet those are precisely the banks holding the life savings of millions. In such a moment, the first thing that comes to mind is the state's deposit guarantee. Would that guarantee really protect anyone in a genuine collapse? On paper it exists. By analysts' reading, it would be useless. And here the tragedy turns into a vicious circle. The more frightened people are, the more they withdraw. The more everyone rushes for cash at once, the faster the banks fall. Once they fall, most of those savings never come back. It has reached the point where the queues in Russia are no longer only at petrol stations. They stretch outside the banks too. Everyone trying to save their money before it's too late. Recall the black smoke over Omsk from the top of this video. 2,500 kilometers inside the border, one of the deepest blows of the war. What's truly striking, though, isn't a single refinery, but the pattern behind it. Omsk was the last untouched facility among Russia's 11 largest refineries. With it hit, every one of them has now taken at least one strike. If a plant in the middle of Siberia can be targeted, then there is no such thing as a safe rear area anymore. The real weapon is speed. Repairing a refinery takes weeks, sometimes months, while the next strike usually arrives far sooner. Ukraine's drone maker is turning out hundreds of long-range drones a day and plans to push production higher still. So Moscow has to keep its refinery network in an endless repair and breakdown loop. And in that loop, time always works in Kyiv's favor. To see what this crisis means for an ordinary Russian, the petrol stations are enough. Long queues formed outside Lukoil stations in Moscow, and rationing has been introduced in more than 50 regions. The starkest case is Omsk. In the city of that very refinery we just described, drivers were limited to just 40 liters per vehicle while the plant was under attack. The irony of the scene sits right there. A country that fuels the world with its oil is handing out petrol to its own drivers by the liter. In some regions, stations have shut entirely. In others, sales run only at certain hours. The crisis has spread so widely across the country that the city of Irkutsk had to bring in portable toilets for those waiting in line and raise public transport fares. The Moscow refinery, which covers roughly 40% of the capital's fuel, is said to need at least 3 months of repairs, meaning the shortage will run through the summer. The scale of the desperation is given away by a single development. One of the world's largest energy exporters began importing at least 60,000 tons of petrol from India from 1st July to cover the gap. With export bans in force, refineries were even permitted to produce lower-grade fuel. The import is itself an admission. A country that sold fuel to the world for years, now buying petrol from abroad, is the clearest proof of how deep the crisis runs. Nor is it a lasting fix. It's a temporary patch covering only part of the shortfall. Putin has acknowledged the crisis and set up a task force for distribution. Yet in public, he keeps playing the danger down. For the person on the street, this is not a danger to be played down. In some regions, finding fuel locks up daily life. No way to get to work, rising prices, queues that last hours. For an ordinary Russian, the crisis is no longer an abstract headline, but a concrete fact met at the pump each morning. That is what truly unsettles the regime, since economic discontent is the fuel that converts fastest into political unrest. All the more so with September's elections at the door. The panic has its echo at the level of the state too. Even state television's loudest voice, Margarita Simonyan, changed her tone and began preparing the public for austerity. Recalling that in the past, not only petrol but even bread was rationed, she said, "We endured it then and will endure it now. Stop whining." Holding up Soviet-era ration cards instead of a solution gives away the true scale of this crisis all on its own. All these pieces point to one picture, not a sudden collapse, but a slow suffocation. Moscow's military spending, by official figures, runs to roughly 7 to 8% of national income. German intelligence estimates it far higher, nearly 2/3 above the official number, close to 10%. Spending in the first quarter of 2026 rose by about 1/3 year on year. While the weapons plants hum along, the civilian economy is left gasping. The engine of an economy that grows on paper is almost entirely war spending, and civilian demand is weak. The experts' language is hardening as well. The Kiel Institute says Russia's war economy has reached its limits. Another American think tank calls the picture an outright abyss. The timing runs squarely against Russia. The physical destruction is mounting precisely as the revenue that would repair it shrinks. While drones hit the terminals, the price of the Urals crude Russia sells has fallen by roughly 1/3 over the past month, down to the 60s. So Moscow can sell less and gets less for what it does sell. The gold and currency reserves it burns to cover the gap are shrinking in both price and volume. The regime's tactic is a familiar one: delay and look away. Bad loans get restructured, bankruptcies get postponed, the problem gets tossed into the next quarter. This method buys time, yet it enlarges the bill. Deferred debt returns with interest, and blocked bankruptcies pile up. So the crisis deepens not all at once, but with every postponed invoice. Panic is averted in the short run, while the load falls harder on the following year. History warns against such balances. Economies propped up by excessive military spending may look strong in the short term, but they rot from within over the long one. The Kremlin's whole bet is to win the war before that rot completes. The queues at the pumps and the holes in the banks raise the question of whom time is really working against. Moscow still holds cards, of course. Oil revenue, accumulated reserves, tight state control. Every one of those cards is of the melting kind, thinning a little more the longer the war runs. When a country tries to finance both its guns and its butter at once, at some point, it has to cut both. Now let's put both fronts in a single frame. The same drone campaign aimed at the refineries cuts not only the petrol, but the export revenue that sells that petrol and fills the budget. So bread and bank, stomach and wallet come under strain at once. A third arm makes the picture heavier still. The falling world price of oil erodes what export revenue remains: pump, terminal, and price. The bill for pressure from those three directions lands on both the war budget and the ordinary Russian's dinner table. And the most striking part is that all these admissions come from inside the regime. Odradne from the Duma, Gref from the largest bank, CMASF from among Kremlin-linked economists. In September's Duma elections, this pressure on fuel, bread, and prices is very likely to show up at the ballot box. Russia won't collapse overnight. Systems like this wear down quietly, from within. But what we're looking at is not the picture of a healthy economy. And once a regime's own deputies and bankers begin to utter the word defeat this openly, the crack is far deeper than it appears. This is not a prophecy, but an X-ray. And what shows on the film is a patient steadily getting worse. The cause of that decline has a name. A patient siege that Ukraine tightens a little more each night, with the blows going not backward, but ever deeper. In a war now past its 4th year, the one thing that hasn't changed is who pays the heaviest bill: ordinary people. In these very days, Russia struck Kiev, and dozens of civilians lost their lives. So what do you think? Can this two-front pressure force Russia to the table, or will the Kremlin suppress this crisis too and sustain the war for years? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's exclusive analyses like this, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.
Damn, there's no end in sight. I've already counted 35 kilometers. Logistics come to a complete halt. Transportation is completely destroyed.
Trucks in Russia are throwing in the towel. While Putin needs every drop of fuel to continue the war, thousands of trucks on his country's highways have already admitted defeat. As a massive diesel crisis hits both road and rail transportation hard at the same time, a growing wave of rebellion is sweeping through thousands of drivers amid the resulting chaos. But before we get there, a small request. Independent war and economics analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video isn't reaching many of the people who'd be interested. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It only takes a few seconds. Now let's look at the main point where this anger and revolt are boiling up, and every root that grinds to a halt shakes the very essence of Russian society a little more, especially as the deep scars of the Soviet years of scarcity still linger in the country's collective memory. Nowadays, drivers aren't waiting in the queue anymore. They're dropping their cargoes and turning off their engines. The whole picture fits into a single number. Fuel queues on the highways stretching to 35 kilometers, unthinkable per litre limits. Truckers waiting at the pump, some for a day, some for 4. The country is on alert. Restrictions have spread from 89 regions to 88, and the crisis has already touched the daily lives of nearly 50 million people. And the words of a driver filming at midnight in the Siberian city of Chita sum up the mood of the entire country.
What a fucking mess. Just a total mess. People are ready to fight each other with knives. It's just a fucking mess, the Russian government. But on TV, they show that everything here is fucking awesome. Is this fucking awesome?
We're going to follow this collapse from its source to its far end, from the revolt on the highway, to the abandoned trucks, to the crumbling railway, to the winter test awaiting 2 metropolises.
We produce this oil ourselves, for f***'s sake. How can there be no gas, man? We've got this oil right here. If you dig a hole in the ground, oil pours out.
So you're saying our government is lying to us, Kirill?
No, not the government. It's the people. The people who stand in line.
Since that place is no ordinary city, it is the critical logistics node feeding both the Russian army and an entire society. Chita sits right on top of the Trans-Siberian corridor that links Moscow to Beijing, this empire's main artery. Putin built his whole war economy on the calculation that if Europe closes, the East opens. And the physical name of that eastern gate is this corridor. Along that artery flows not only gasoline, goods from China, food headed to stores, even war material bound for the front all move along the same route. Now that artery is clogging before our eyes, and the wave is rolling westward. At the far end of the chain stand 2 metropolises of 25 million, Moscow and St. Petersburg, whose shelves are already trembling before winter is even at the door. And a single question sits in every Russian's mind. How will this winter pass? Now let's step into that queue. The rawest form of that anger came on the night of June 26th from Chita, 350 kilometers from the Chinese border.
What a fucking mess. Just a total mess. People are ready to fight each other with knives. It's just a fucking mess, the Russian government. But on TV, they show that everything here is fucking awesome. Is this fucking awesome?
You have to wait hours at the stations for 30 liters of gasoline or 200 liters of diesel. Sheer madness. This man isn't alone. The scale of the wait shows in a story that reached the independent press. A driver trying to get home to St. Petersburg in a car he'd bought in Vladivostok spent a full 39 hours in the queue at Chita just to fill his tank. Note the route: Pacific to Baltic, the Trans-Siberian itself. On that line, time is now measured not in hours but in queues. The queue itself has become a matter of state. In Zabaikalsky, officials switched to a QR code sales system just to manage the line. Police and volunteers stand watch over the night queues so fuel isn't siphoned from tanks with hoses. Drivers, meanwhile, do among themselves what the state cannot. Which station has fuel? Which queue is shorter? They've built shared maps marking all of it, tipping each other off by phone. When a country's supply planning is left to drivers' group chats, the system has already gone unofficial. And the math of the limits explains why the anger burst hardest among truckers. A 50-litre cap can save a car owner's day, but for a truck that burns hundreds of litres and hauls tons of cargo, 40 or 50 litres is the same as not setting out at all. Even the generous 200-litre exceptions barely reach the next dry pump across Siberia's 1,000-kilometre legs. The driver reroutes, loses a day, and the sector has already sent the bill. Hauliers announced tariff hikes of at least 10% starting July 1st, and by insider accounts, this is only the beginning, since planning a run across Siberia and the border regions has become effectively impossible. And then comes the threshold. Some drivers no longer even wait, since they've run out of fuel to wait on. In a video that hit social media, a Russian driver describes how the homeward journey he set out on with a 50-ton load has ended.
So my trip home with a 50 metric ton load has come to an end. I passed Chernyshevsk and pulled over. There's no fuel anywhere. It's 200 kilometers to Chita, but there's no point in driving all the way there. Standing on the side of the road, running out of gas, that's not what we want. But here, at least, there's a hotel, a shower, and everything I need. Tomorrow, I'll go to a village. Maybe I'll help some old lady chop some firewood or do some chores around the house, because there's nothing else to do. Who knows when fuel will become available again.
And he leaves his truck, cargo and all, by the edge of the highway and walks away. In that single clip is hidden the rupture of an entire chain. Every trailer left by the roadside is raw material a factory is waiting on, a store's weekly order, a construction site's supplies, all of it in the middle of the steppe, unclaimed. And every abandoned vehicle locks the already narrowed road a little more. Seen from the driver's window, the picture is crueler still. This was already a hard trade. Now late delivery penalties, broken contracts and earnings melting away in the queue have piled on top. For anyone hauling refrigerated cargo, every hour is a separate gamble. The cooler on the trailer also burns diesel, so the driver has to choose whether to give his last fuel to the tank or to the generator keeping the load alive. It's no surprise then that drivers are starting to say, "I'm not making this run." The first signs have come too. Some small carriers have suspended their interregional runs entirely. Parts of the map have effectively fallen off the trucking network. And here is the danger. If this trend spreads, then even if fuel is found one day, there'll be no one left to take the wheel. Don't forget the distances either. In this geography, a delivery that normally takes a week or two can stretch into months with the hunt for fuel, the waits in queues and the rerouting. In Siberia's emptiness, every settlement, every mine, every garrison that can't be resupplied begins to live its own small shortage. And on top of all this sit two chronic weaknesses. A skilled driver shortage that has gone unclosed for years and an aging transport fleet. The system ran tense even on its healthy days. The fuel shock landed on an already weary spine. Russia is a giant sprawled across 11 time zones, but what holds this giant together on the east-west axis is almost a single corridor. From the crossings on the Chinese border through Zabaikalsk and Chita, the Trans-Siberian Highway and its parallel railway run west, through Novosibirsk and the Urals to Moscow, and from there to St. Petersburg. Tundra to the north, foreign borders to the south. Alternatives are next to none. Seeing what flows through that single artery tells you the scale. Electronics and spare parts from China, everything landing at the Far Eastern ports, Siberia's raw materials. Trade between Russia and China broke records in recent years, topping $200 billion, and the land leg of that vast trade sits right on this corridor. When the artery is singular, a queue in Cheetah stops being Cheetah's problem. The cargo on those trucks is being awaited thousands of kilometers to the west. And what passes through this artery isn't only civilian goods. The eastern leg of the war materiel bound for the front runs on the same line. The North Korean origin munition shipments that Western intelligence has repeatedly reported are carried west from the Pacific transit points over these very Trans-Siberian rails. The Kremlin's dilemma is therefore two-layered. The more it gives scarce fuel to the army first, the deeper the civilian crisis. But the more civilian logistics collapse, the more the army's own supply artery is squeezed into the same bottleneck. The same rail, the same road, and the same diesel that isn't enough for both. Then there's the door of friends. One of the main routes of the grey imports that dodge Western sanctions runs through Kazakhstan. But by the accounts coming through, inspections at those border gates are tightening, and sanctions checks are lengthening the truck queues. The Kremlin's entire economic story was built on, if Europe closes, China opens. The physical infrastructure of that story is exactly this corridor and these gates. As both narrow at once, the real limit of the pivot to the east comes into view. Shake hands with Beijing all you like, but if the tank of the truck that carries the goods is empty, that partnership stays on paper. So if the roads are this gridlocked, why isn't all this cargo being transported by train? Russia's massive railway network is the first solution that comes to mind. But the least discussed and most frightening aspect of the crisis begins right here, and the answer is much darker than you might think. But before we get to that, a quick interlude. Your like, a one-word comment, and your subscription directly help this analysis reach many more people. It only takes a few seconds. Ordinary logic says, if the roads are clogged, cargo goes to rail. But in Russia, that door is shut too. And the reason is the most alarming part of the picture. Russian Railways, RZD, is living through its worst crisis in 16 years. Far from being an alternative, it can barely carry its own weight. The network is so clogged that by one estimate, roughly 300,000 wagons, nearly a fifth of the fleet, sit idle on tracks, in depots, and in marshalling yards. Some freight trains have been abandoned in place for months, and the people to move the trains are running out too. By industry compilations, RZD cancels roughly 200 services every day. The company is short 2,500 engine drivers and 3,000 locomotive crew personnel, and some divisions operate with only 60% of the staff they need. Freight volume has fallen 13% from 2021, hitting its lowest point in 16 years. RZD's debt reached 4 trillion rubles by the start of 2026. The company asked the state for $10 billion in emergency cash and didn't get it. RZD carries nearly half of all cargo in Russia and, with pipelines set aside, around 87% of it. So when the railway shakes, what shakes isn't one sector. It's the backbone of the country's industrial economy and of the army's resupply. While official figures claim growth, the emptying freight trains tell a very different story. The real state of the economy is read not in the Kremlin's charts, but on the rails. At the root of the rot is a structural collapse building for years. Locomotive production is falling, despite Kremlin orders to raise it. In the first 4 months of 2025, electric locomotive output fell 13%, and diesel locomotive output 6%. With no replacements for retired locomotives, thousands of new wagons sit unused at factories for lack of an engine to pull them. And one detail sums up management's priorities. In 2024, an eighth of the company's investment budget went not to critical locomotive purchases, but to a headquarters skyscraper in Moscow. As the network collapsed, the money went to a tower. Now combine this picture with the fuel crisis. This is the truly frightening part. Russia's main lines are largely electrified, but the network's non-electrified sections, the cross-border runs, and all the shunting traffic that lines up wagons in depots are pulled by diesel locomotives, which means the rail's last link, the very one that connects to the trucks and feeds the depots, depends on diesel. The diesel shortage scorching the country, the same shortage that stops the trucks, is drying up this lifeline of the railway too. The first ruptures showed at the borders. In early July, Russia closed its 7 rail border crossings with the Baltic states, a decision driven as much by economics and fuel as by politics. The old diesel locomotives that pull cross-border cargo burn a great deal of fuel, and every rerouted shipment ends up both more expensive and slower. And then there's the order of priority. The state has ordered military shipments to go ahead of civilian cargo, meaning scarce capacity and scarce fuel go to the front first, and civilian wagons fall further back. A state that laid rail all the way to the land corridor to Crimea throughout the war now can't spare those same rails for civilians' bread. And that simple rule from the very start holds here too. However far the train goes, the last step from railhead to store, from silo to bakery, is almost always a diesel truck. So the railway can never fully take over the trucking crisis. At the end of the road, there's a truck again, an empty tank again. Here is the deadly bond between the two arteries. Road and rail are not each other's backup. They share the same diesel, suffer the same congestion, and are dragged toward the same collapse. When one clogs, the load should shift to the other. In this system, where a second artery should open when one locks up, there is no second artery left. So why did the fuel run out all at once in both these arteries? The answer is in the heart of the single source that feeds them both. Russia's largest refinery and #1 gasoline producer, Omsk, right on this line, in the middle of Siberia, halted production after a July strike. The depot that fed the trucks crossing Siberia is now empty itself. And Omsk isn't alone. By the Financial Times, up to 40% of Russia's refining capacity is out of service. The Chokepoint refinery that feeds the capital is shut, after successive strikes, for at least 6 months, probably through year's end. The human scale of this picture, too, is hidden in a single number. The restrictions, outages, and limits directly affect nearly 50 million people, roughly 1 in 3 Russians. And the Kremlin's answer gives away its own diagnosis. First gasoline, then diesel exports were banned entirely through the end of July. A fuel giant placed an embargo on its own exports. Even as Putin called the crisis not critical in the statement acknowledging it, the step taken says the opposite. And the repair is not as easy as flicking a switch. What's destroyed is often not just walls, but the production line itself. And replacing precision equipment that can't be imported under sanctions takes months, sometimes years. So this is not a temporary disruption certain to end tomorrow. It is a lasting wound whose self-repair grows structurally harder. The timing of this crisis is a disaster in itself. It landed right on the harvest season. Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, and the combines, tractors and trucks that bring in that wheat run on diesel. When the fuel runs out at the very moment the fields need it most, a chilling picture emerges. By Reuters, farmers in Russia's Black Earth region fear they won't be able to bring in the harvest if they can't find fuel for their machines. In one case, surfacing from the field, a farmer had to drive his combine straight to a filling station because he wasn't allowed to fill a jerry can.
It's 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm going there. It's already 3 kilometers. Or these who are walking around taking photos say it's 100 rubles here, 115 rubles for gas. I personally don't care. I want to fill up, go to work. The fact that it's 115 rubles, well, it'll be a day or two, well.
Even Putin's reaction to this picture shows he's aware of the danger. In the statement acknowledging the crisis, he stressed that keeping fuel flowing to the agricultural sector was vital, saying the harvest depended on it. The world's grain granary has come to fear it can't find the diesel to reap its own field. Russia's 2 great metropolises, together with their surroundings, mean roughly 25 million people. And these 2 cities' tables are filled not by what they produce, but by the thousands of trucks that must flow in without a break each day, a good share of them coming from the eastern and southern lines, whose anatomy we just laid out. The first cracks are no longer rumor, but written record. By Moscow Times, food producers have begun sending formal delay notices to supermarket chains in St. Petersburg. A producer in Ulyanovsk wrote to the retailer that its trucks might be late due to force majeure, asking that no delivery penalty be charged. One chain manager calls the situation not critical yet, but he too confirms that out-of-town suppliers are reporting delays. When the phrase force majeure enters supply contracts, it is a declaration that the system no longer trusts its own workings. St. Petersburg's fragility is also historical. For centuries, this city was the window opening to Europe. Its shelves, too, were largely filled by imports from the West. Sanctions shut that door, and the metropolis of 5 million suddenly found itself dependent on trucks from the far other end of the country, from the east and south. So today, a queue in Chita, by geography's irony, most threatens that old European city on the Baltic shore. Its shelf-level meaning, by the experts, is not an empty store, something subtler. First, the variety narrows. Short-lived, transport-dependent goods like fresh vegetables, milk and eggs become harder to reach. Then the price tags start to climb. Indeed, from late May into early July, basic vegetable prices rose sharply. The freight rate for grain hauling trucks rose an average of 20 to 30% by analyses cited in Kommersant, and freight, sooner or later, gets written onto the price tag. A store video shared from the field shows the display window of this arithmetic. A jar of coffee from 599 rubles to 1,253. In the bitter words of the Russian filming it, everything's going according to plan. And in the city, the rule doesn't change. From depot to store, from market to restaurant, from bakery to corner shop, every delivery is again made by a diesel vehicle. Even if goods reach the city, if there's no fuel to distribute them within it, the shelf stays empty all the same. On top of that, the refineries feeding the capital are targets of the same campaign. Among the main supply points, Ryazan has been struck repeatedly. Now add the calendar and the memory to this picture. Winter in this geography is not a season but a trial. Roads ice over, distances stretch, breakdowns multiply. Indeed, just last December, even before the crisis reached this scale, the Trans-Siberian highway was paralyzed at -20 degrees by an 85-kilometer queue. Drivers were stranded for hours, truckers for days. Now, a nationwide fuel crisis is being added to that same corridor. And these images carry a particular echo in Russian society. Empty shelves, long queues, basic goods put on rations. These recall the shortage days of the Soviet era. And shortage often begins in mines before shelves. When everyone who hears of a delay rushes to stock up at once, shelves empty even without a real supply problem. A photo of an empty shelf breeds fresh panic, and fresh panic breeds a fresh empty shelf. In two metropolises of 25 million, triggering this cycle even once could turn the crisis into a self-feeding avalanche. And the layer of this story that truly frightens the Kremlin is not economic, but political. Russia's truckers are not as quiet a class as the regime assumes. In 2015, drivers rose across the country against a road tax called Platon, marching on Moscow in convoys and giving the Kremlin one of the broadest-based protests of the post-war era through months of action. That day the issue was a tax. Today's issue is the impossibility of the trade itself. An empty tank touches a place a tax could not: bread. What's more, the Kremlin's old tools for managing this anger have gone dull. The censorship machine can shut a newspaper, silence a channel. But every driver waiting in the queue now carries a broadcast station in his pocket. The state's image in the provinces is eroding its authority too. The governor of Stavropol, to save 3,000 tons of fuel a month, forced his own bureaucrats out of their official cars and onto bicycles. In Sverdlovsk, a station gave away a larder by lottery to draw customers. When an empire's provincial administration is peddling because it can't find fuel, the crisis is no longer a statistic, but daily life. And in the public's eyes, the state's power evaporates in exactly such scenes. The numbers tell the same story. By compilations based on Rosstat data, gasoline rose nearly 7% month-on-month in June, and diesel over 7%. annual inflation accelerated again. With the country average around 72 rubles a litre, Reuters correspondents logged more than double that in shortage-hit regions. The same country, the same fuel, two separate price planets. On the budget front, the shears are merciless. In the first half of the year, oil and gas revenues fell more than 22% year-on-year. The Kremlin is bleeding on two fronts at once. At home, it can't get its citizens fuel. Abroad, the revenue that finances the war is melting. And the ironic footnote: some of the European countries sending weapons to Ukraine have raised their purchases of Russian natural gas ahead of the full 2027 ban. Moscow, begging for fuel at one door, can still sell gas at the other. Put all the pieces together: trucks stranded in Siberia, unclaimed cargo by the roadside, suspended runs, the corridor's own refinery gone silent, the written delay notices heading to St. Petersburg, and the coming winter. These pieces, each looking like a separate event, are in fact links of the same chain. The country shown on screen was picture perfect, while the country he stood in was collapsing. And this is the moment regimes fear most. The moment everyone begins to see with their own eyes that the country on screen and the country on the road are no longer the same country. Propaganda cannot fill the shelves. A truck fills the shelves. And those trucks' tanks are empty. So what do you think? Will this fuel crisis drag Russia into a genuine political rupture by winter? Or will the Kremlin once again manage to run the queues and empty shelves? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's analyses like this one, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us. A quick break. Liking, a one-word comment and subscribing directly help this video reach far more people. Since we're now turning to why this proposal isn't a fantasy, and how Russia has already lived through it once. Russia has already lived through an evacuation like this. When Ukrainian forces entered the Kursk region in August 2024, Moscow was forced to declare a federal-level emergency. More than 76,000 people were evacuated in the first days. Within 2 weeks, the figure passed 120,000. By Russian officials' own data, roughly 150,000 people in the border areas needed evacuating, and by the end of August, about 133,000 of them had either been moved or left by their own means. The picture that emerged in those days matters for understanding today's proposal. Counter-terrorism measures, including phone surveillance and movement restrictions, were declared in the region. Temporary accommodation centers were set up, and what got talked about most was the chaos on the ground itself. Many people accused the authorities of warning them too late and of failing to organize the evacuation properly. So what Solovyov is proposing today isn't a theoretical exercise. It's something Russia did 2 years ago, on a far smaller scale, and struggled with. The figure being discussed now is 2 to 3 times that. And it's worth remembering what that evacuation looked like. Families loaded onto buses, weeks spent in temporary shelters, queues for humanitarian aid, and homes left behind. An evacuation order is a single sentence on paper. On the ground, it is tens of thousands of separate lives turned upside down. There's another difference too. The 2024 evacuation was urgent and temporary. People thought they were leaving for a few weeks. What's being proposed now is closer to permanent resettlement. People taken thousands of kilometers away to build a new life. The distance between those two is the distance between temporary shelter and displacement. The political lesson drawn at the time is meaningful for today as well. The anger that surfaced in Kursk was directed largely at local authorities. Most Russian political observers assessed that it wouldn't turn into serious pressure on the center. So the system knows how to bill this kind of crisis to the region and shield the center. But one thing has changed. What happened then occurred in a single region and hinged on a surprise ground incursion. What's being discussed now spans multiple regions and rests not on a ground operation, but on continuous pressure from the air. The first was an event, the second is a condition. There's something easily missed in this debate. The places being discussed are not empty steppe. Belgorod, Kursk, and Bryansk are among Russia's most productive regions, and beneath them, above them, and within them sit assets that carry the country's economic backbone. Start below ground. The geological structure around Kursk is known as one of the largest iron ore basins on Earth. A significant share of the ore that feeds Russian steel comes out of it. So that strip along the border is also where the artery supplying the country's heavy industry begins. Then above ground. Belgorod is among Russia's leading regions in agriculture and food production. In grain, sugar beet, and above all poultry, it carries decisive weight on a national scale. The concrete substance of what the Kremlin has for years called food sovereignty is precisely this soil. And then, energy. The Kursk region hosts one of the country's large nuclear power plants. It feeds not only the region, but a wide surrounding grid. And that facility sits right beside the unlivable strip Solovyov described on air. Now set those three layers side by side: mining, agriculture, and energy. The three most fundamental branches of any state's production. Nor are these subsidized provinces propped up by aid from Moscow. On the contrary, they're regions that contribute to the center through what they produce. So emptying them wouldn't only be a humanitarian matter, it would tear a hole directly in the state's revenue side. And here lies the least discussed cost of the evacuation proposal. When you remove people from a region, you remove the hand that operates it along with them. The shift that runs the mine, the farmer who works the field, the technician who runs the plant, the driver behind the wheel. All of them are inside that same population. A facility doesn't need a bomb to stop. It stops when its workers are gone. And a military layer enters here as well. These regions don't only produce, they're also the corridors through which logistics to the front travel. Rail lines, road connections, fuel and munitions shipments all pass through these provinces. A region drained of its civilian population also loses the local capacity that turns that logistics wheel. Its repair shops, its depots, its workers, the crews that keep the infrastructure maintained. So, let's empty the 40-kilometer strip, reads on paper like a security measure. In practice, it means converting productive land into a military buffer. And when a state is forced to turn its own fertile ground into a buffer zone, territory has been lost there without a battle being lost. The historical echo is striking too. For 200 years, Russia built its security on depth. Even if an enemy came in, the country's vastness would swallow him. Yet that strategy worked at the price of leaving the abandoned ground to the enemy. What's being discussed today is different. Emptying your own territory by your own hand, with no enemy entering and no one occupying it. The first was a defensive doctrine. The second is an admission that even that doctrine no longer works. When a state's defensive doctrine collapses and its leaders openly discuss abandoning the borders, the internal fracture of the nation becomes inevitable. Russia is on the verge of a breakdown, and the people are now launching a war against the regime.
Вы об этом подумали, скажите? Зачем вы нас в подвал суете? Идите, господин Путин, сами в подвал!
We have seen demands for Vladimir Putin to resign many times. We have seen uprisings against the regime, from St. Petersburg to Moscow city officials, from high-ranking generals to parliament.
We've told you Putin 10 times. The first quarter was a complete disaster.
But they were people from within the state, and the system immediately crushed them. But now the cries of resign and enough is enough have taken to the streets and launched a war against the regime and Putin. And this changes everything, because the moment the loyal Russian masses demand Putin's resignation, and this becomes a daily norm, the footsteps of Russia's 1917 revolution have already begun to echo. The most striking example of this came from the Samara region. On April 30th, a video that exploded across social media showed Russian women stepping directly in front of cameras and unleashing an unprecedented rage against the Russian leader.
They are sending us to garages filled with gasoline and cars. They're shoving us into these basements, and I am deeply convinced that everyone, starting from the president, must be removed from office.
The women are naming Putin directly, telling him, "You go live in the basement," and openly demanding the president's resignation. In Russia, such explicit, on-camera, name-calling criticism is extremely rare. This was a clear indication that the people had openly declared war on the regime. In reality, the people's demands were very basic: security, enough income to survive, and peace. But as the Russian economy entered a serious freefall, state institutions had become unable to meet even the most basic social needs. The war had now reached the windows of ordinary Russian citizens in all its brutal reality. When people began spending their daily lives in fear of death, in makeshift flooded shelters, their patience was exhausted. Look, in those same days, a Russian citizen from Tuapse was rising up on social media, dramatically questioning the Putin regime.
I'm not afraid of NATO right now. It's leaving the house that scares me. The sirens are wailing, it's raining oil, and you can't see the sun through the smoke. It's pretty much exactly how I imagined the bright future under our government's leadership.
The Tuapse refinery had been struck for the 4th time in 2 weeks, including on May 1st, 2026. The city was caught between security and ecological disaster, and the regime had been silent for days. And look, let's return to that hair-raising video from Samara. The woman in the black jacket directly challenges,
"Where is our shelter? Tell me. Why are you putting us in the basement? Go, Mr. Putin, to the basement yourself."
This is the most naked face of the regime's indifferent and humiliating attitude toward its own people. For them, this is not a simple matter of inadequate shelters. It is deliberate negligence and a crime from start to finish. The state mechanism had already collapsed long before the war decision was made, but officials looked the other way. Failing to foresee that the war would spill onto Russian soil once the operation began, or being caught unprepared for it, was sheer stupidity. Leaving the people this defenseless is no longer a simple mistake. It is seen as an open crime. This is why the women are putting forward the harshest demand. Starting with the president, all governors, mayors, the entire administrative chain must immediately be removed. They must resign. They are throwing the reality of, "We are dying here," in their faces, and openly declaring that no one will ever silence their voices again. These words go far beyond an ordinary complaint. They are one of the most powerful objections showing that the people's patience with the regime has burst, and the voice of "enough" has descended to the streets. Moreover, the Russian people are not alone in their criticism. In this war they have launched against the regime. Famous Russian influencer Victoria Bonya addressed Putin directly in an 18-minute Instagram video. She said, "The people are afraid of you. Governors are not telling the truth. The economy and internet restrictions are a disaster." And she added, "Between you and us ordinary people, there is a huge, thick wall." The video went viral with millions of views, but the criticism was not confined to social media influencers. It spread to official state institutions and regional councils. The objections rising in parliamentary corridors are no longer whispered behind closed doors. On April 22nd, a Duma deputy addressed Putin directly.
"We've told you Putin 10 times. The economy is bound to collapse. The first quarter was a complete disaster. If you don't take immediate action, financial, economic, and otherwise, then in the fall we'll face what happened in 1917.
1917. In the 4th year of World War I, prolonged trench warfare and economic collapse had led to the February Revolution. A Duma deputy drawing this parallel is not random. This is an alarm coming from within the system. In fact, the roots of these bold outbursts run much deeper and are structural in nature. The spark of this courage was struck months earlier in Putin's hometown of St. Petersburg, in the Smolninskoye Municipal Council. This local council went beyond mere political criticism. It submitted an official petition to the State Duma, shattering Russia's greatest taboo. They demanded Putin's removal from office on charges of treason for the war in Ukraine. Moreover, these council members did not resort to emotional slogans. They presented 4 fundamental arguments based on the regime's own constitution. These arguments were the army's destruction, demographic catastrophe, economic collapse, and strategic defeat. They knew the Duma would never try Putin. Their aim was to light a torch in the darkness, and they said it. The real crisis behind this reaction is the massive bankruptcy of the state's civil defense infrastructure. According to current reports published by Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, 67% of civil defense shelters across Russia are unusable. Geolocated data from the field and local telegram channels document that a significant portion of shelters in Tatarstan, Belgorod, and even Moscow's outskirts have been locked with rusty padlocks. Those that are open are flooded with sewage or groundwater due to infrastructure failures, corroded pipe systems, and years of neglect. Efforts to modernize the warning system have encountered delays and are not expected to be completed before 2028. So, the situation is this. Ukrainian drones are reaching deep into Russia, sirens are blaring, factories are burning, but the people have nowhere to shelter. Right in the middle of this crisis, the fact that demands for private underground shelters from wealthy elites, bureaucrats and oligarchs in Moscow and St. Petersburg have recently surged by 140% proves the asymmetric decay within the system and how class division has reached a lethal dimension. The systematic collapse of Russia's air defense network has transformed this shelter crisis from a simple infrastructure problem into a direct matter of life and death for millions. In particular, the complete ineffectiveness of S-400 batteries, Nebo SVU early warning radars, and Pantsir S-1 short-range protection systems against Ukraine's electronic warfare-supported asymmetric technologies has left the rear front defenseless. Advanced Western analyses show that 40 to 50 critical air defense units are being wiped out on a regular monthly basis on the front line and beyond borders. This heavy equipment loss has weakened the defense umbrella around the capital and left cities deep in the interior practically naked against swarms of threats from the sky. The sophisticated operations carried out one after another by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces definitively document that even Russia's geography at depths of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers is no longer a safe, peaceful rear area. Now, even the Z blog writers who had been propagandizing the system for years have reached the point where they cannot deny the current reality. Z blogger Yevgeny Golman screamed his desperation. "We're ruined, completely ruined. 80% of my friends have shut down their businesses. The system has collapsed. They are lying to Vladimir Vladimirovich, and they continue to lie." Golman's use of the irony, "If only the Tsar knew, he would fix everything," is Russia's oldest lament pattern. But now people are beginning to understand that the Tsar knows and simply does not care. The sharp decline in public support rates also confirms this strategic checkmate. According to VTSIOM data, Putin's approval rating has dropped to 65.6%, the lowest level since the start of the Ukraine invasion. The trust rating has declined to 71%, and the decline has been continuing for 7 consecutive weeks. Independent analysts indicate the real figure may be even lower, because in an authoritarian country, people are hesitant to express their true thoughts, even in surveys. Former deputy and one-time presidential candidate Boris Nadezhdin summarizes this shift. People are beginning to understand that there is a direct connection between their daily problems, healthcare, food prices, internet issues, and Vladimir Putin's policies. This is a new situation in Russia. For years, Russians thought, if Putin knew, he would fix it. Now they are beginning to understand that the source of the problem is Putin himself. And history is full of cautionary examples. In World War I, prolonged trench warfare and economic collapse had led to the February Revolution of 1917. The Tsar thought his power was solid. Within a few months, he was toppled. The Afghanistan War had worn down the Soviet system over a decade. Even without a direct uprising, it contributed to the collapse. Prigozhin's 2023 march was short-lived, but it had shown how fragile the system was. Even a parallel military force marching on Moscow was possible.
Do you know how poor we've all become? I decided to do the math this morning. I used only the official raw stat inflation data from the beginning of 2022 to April 2026, and it came out to almost 44%. 44% is how poor we've all become, how much our earnings have devalued. So, if you're earning 100,000 rubles now, it's the same as if you were earning 56,000 rubles at the end of 2021. Now ask yourself, how many of us have increased our earnings by 44% over the years, just to stay the same, just to afford the same things we had 4 years ago? Now let public sector workers ask themselves, which public sector workers got their salaries raised by 44% for this?
Analysts say the probability of a full uprising is currently low. But even if Russians cannot launch a mass rebellion, through complaint videos shared on social media, they can very clearly show that discontent and anger are rising. Behind the Russians' rage are concrete numbers, and these numbers are shattering the Kremlin's strong economy narrative. Today in Russia, 100,000 rubles is equivalent to 56,000 rubles in 2021. In 4 years, salaries have lost nearly half their value. To maintain the previous standard of living, salaries would have needed to increase several times over, but they did not. The labor reserve has dropped from 7 million to 4.4 million in 4 years. A large portion of working-age men have either joined the army or left the country. Those remaining have been redirected to the defense industry. 73% of businesses are experiencing serious personnel shortages, and 2 million new workers are needed every year until 2030. But traditional sources like migrant workers from Central Asia are also declining. Manufacturing, construction, oil and gas, logistics, the sectors that form any country's economic backbone. When workers cannot be found in these sectors, production stops, supply chains break, projects collapse. Russia's war economy is actually draining the civilian economy's blood. Every worker attracted to the military and defense sector with high wages is locking the door of a factory or construction site. Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina has acknowledged the severity. Such a situation has never been seen in Russia's modern history, and this situation is affecting the entire economic picture. And the economic collapse is not just in the numbers, it is in people's daily lives. In the Belgorod region, the compensation fund for civilian casualties has completely run out. The answer given to a woman requesting compensation for her burned car and destroyed garage was short. There is no money left in the fund. Deputy Governor Olga Medvedeva delivered this answer officially. Previously, a citizen had been asked to send photos of their damaged vehicle to a blocked Telegram channel, for which they first needed to purchase a VPN. So the state cannot protect its citizens, cannot compensate them when they are harmed, and is even blocking them from filing a compensation claim. All of this is pushing the people's patience to the breaking point and increasing the pressure on Putin to resign. So what can Putin do? Let's look at the options and see where each one leads. Increase repression, the Kremlin's reflex. Protest applications are being rejected, police are knocking on activists' doors, VPNs are being blocked. But societies under pressure explode. Suppressed rage does not disappear, it accumulates. Peskov says, "This is the period we are in," as if it were a temporary situation. But in the 4th year, the word temporary has lost its credibility. Renew propaganda. Turn the Victory Day parade into a scene of national unity. But on those same days, internet in Moscow will be cut. If your phone doesn't work during a victory celebration, what is being celebrated starts to be questioned. Peskov threatens that Ukraine will have to accept harsher terms, but this rhetoric can no longer convince even his own people. New mobilization, the most dangerous option. The 2022 partial mobilization had caused hundreds of thousands of Russians to flee. With approval ratings this low, a second mobilization could be political suicide for the Kremlin. Instead, they are trying to attract volunteers with high salaries and bonuses, but this is also stealing workers from the civilian economy and deepening the already critical personnel crisis. A cycle. Pull workers to the front, factories shut down, economy collapses, discontent rises, apply more pressure. And back to the start. Military retaliation, firing more missiles and drones at Ukraine. But Russia's own air defense network is melting. When winter comes, the entirety of Ukraine's deep strike capacity will be directed at Russian energy infrastructure. And at that point, Moscow's promise of no power cuts will transform from a political joke into reality. Allies. The alliance known as the Krink Axis, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, is throwing Russia a lifeline. Iran and North Korea are providing drones and ammunition. China is giving economic breathing room through energy purchases. But this support is not unconditional. Russia's internal weakness is making its allies nervous. China is calculating the risk of an unstable ally, and Russia's weakness is making Beijing the dominant partner of the alliance. Moscow knows this, but no longer has the strength to prevent it. Historical cycles show us that massive imperial structures and oppressive regimes do not make great noise to the outside just before they collapse. Rather, they rot from within over a long period, silently stretch, their foundational columns weaken, and ultimately collapse into themselves with an unexpected, small tremor. Today, the cold and familiar spectre of the 1917 revolution is wandering again. Not in Moscow's luxury corridors, but in the rage of desperate mothers abandoned to rat-infested basements, in provincial cities whose coffers have been emptied, and in the silent scream of millions of citizens imprisoned in a digital dungeon. The massive military-industrial machine built over years with billions of dollars is no longer grinding the targeted enemy territories. It is mercilessly grinding Russia's own demographics, its own economy, and its own future. The illusion of invincibility and untouchability that had been carefully maintained for so long has now been completely destroyed. The quiet bleeding that had long continued in Russia's vast backyard has now grown to an undeniable scale, an arterial hemorrhage. The rest of the world holds its breath, watching and waiting for the final great fracture and inevitable collapse that this massive geopolitical wreckage, fragmenting from within, will create along the world's fault lines. So do you think this cracking will turn into a fracture? Or will the Kremlin manage to suppress the discontent once again? Share in the comments. To stay informed about PPR Global's analyses, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us. Our video has come to an end, but our analyses do not stop here. If you would like to listen to PPR Global's detailed dossiers on global developments at the comfort of a podcast, during long road trips or daytime breaks, we also invite you to our Spotify channel. Follow our Spotify account right now via the link in the description, and don't fall behind on the world's agenda anywhere, under any circumstances. Crimea is just giving up. Putin hasn't surrendered yet, but for the people of Crimea, everything has already changed.
Unfortunately, we decided to leave Crimea temporarily. Lack of electricity, together with the lack of water, the lack of propane gas for the stove.
In the crown jewel that keeps Putin's regime afloat, Russia's social structure is falling apart right before our eyes.
I am addressing Moscow and Putin on behalf of the people of Crimea. But in reality, we have empty gas stations, fear, inspections, queues, and complete uncertainty.
Life has ground to a halt amid a massive energy and fuel crisis hitting the peninsula, driving the more than 2 million people there first into despair, then into anger. Right now, the situation in Crimea is very bad for Russians. How bad is it? Russian citizens, seen in footage that has gone viral on social media, show just that. These are individuals returning to their hometown of Barnaul, a Siberian city 3,000 kilometers away, a 5-day drive from Crimea. Their single statement sums up the entire situation. Life is impossible. There is no water, no electricity, and no gas. And the nearly 1.5 million Russians on the peninsula feel exactly the same way. Everyone senses the same thing. Something here has ended, and no one believes it will be fixed anytime soon. Which is why people are no longer waiting. They are leaving everything behind and going.
The fuel crisis continues. Please be patient. There won't be large supplies of fuel available anytime soon.
What you see on screen is the 48-kilometer escape queue that formed on the road to the Kerch Strait Bridge. On peak days, the number of vehicles waiting in front of the bridge reached 2,800. And notice that the traffic runs one way only. The exit side is jammed solid, while entry from Russia is close to zero. A bridge tourists once flooded across has turned into an evacuation pipe. Let's pause for a moment on that sentence. Living here is impossible. These people didn't come to Crimea as tourists. Most were settled there as part of Russia's policy of permanently Russifying the peninsula. They were the living proof of the thesis that Crimea is now Russia. Now, those same people are narrating the collapse of that proof from their own phones. A settler asking, is a state's weakest link. the very population it transplanted is begging to go home. And right here sits a dangerous threshold. A regime can ignore enemy propaganda. It cannot ignore its own citizens saying, in their own words,
Today is already the second week since they have been sitting without electricity and water.
On top of this picture landed a sentence from Kiev on July 15th. Zelensky summed up Ukraine's objective in one line.
Our main goal is not Russia without gasoline, but Ukraine without Russia.
Now listen to that sentence with the ears of a Crimean or of a Russian officer stationed in Crimea. This is not a statement of economic policy, it is an eviction notice. Kiev is saying it openly. Our problem is not keeping you in the dark, our problem is that land. And we are coming for that land. For every Russian in Crimea, that translates one way only: leave while you still can. For the Russian army, it carries an even colder meaning. This campaign will not stop until you withdraw. And here is the most striking part. The vanguard of this flight isn't even the ordinary public. Before the people, the families of Black Sea Fleet officers quietly packed their bags. And the last fuel and power left on the peninsula is being distributed not to the public, but to the army and the state offices. What falls to the ordinary Crimean is to wait in the dark. In other words, the state has effectively abandoned the population it transplanted to its fate. And all of it confirms the thesis retired American General Ben Hodges has argued for years. Ukraine doesn't need to take Crimea by fighting for it. Conditions will be brought to such a point that the Russian army will be forced to abandon it on its own. In this video, we'll watch that eviction notice come true step by step. How first the people, then the elite, and finally the army began to leave Crimea. But first, a small request. Independent war and technology analysis like this is being suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd be interested. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It only takes a few seconds. Now, let's begin. What is pouring people into that 48-kilometer queue is not a single problem. Everything needed to stay alive is being taken from them at once. And the freshest blow landed just last night. On the night of July 14th to 15th, Ukraine struck the Balaklava thermal power plant in Sevastopol. Nearly half of occupied Crimea's electricity generation depends on this single plant. The footage on your screen is from that night. Occupation has a price. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces claimed the strike. The plant's machine hall, housing the Siemens turbine cooling system, was damaged. The very turbines that were smuggled onto the peninsula in defiance of European sanctions. After the strike, Sevastopol moved to a regime of 2 hours of electricity, followed by 6 hours of blackout. Yet the Russian guests keep feeding on the illusion, after watching Putin's videos, that things will soon get better. Nothing is getting better. The opposite. The breakdown is compounding in a chain. When the power goes, the water pumps stop,
and the water is running out. To pump water for us, a diesel station also stands idle. No diesel, we will not pump water.
And the ATMs die. The banks can't even hand out cash, since the vehicles that carry the cash have no fuel.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? No deposit withdrawals right now. Cash hasn't been delivered today.
The shops are rationed, the shelves bare. In northern Crimea, there are settlements that have gone more than 10 days without electricity, reporting looting, calling for evacuation, and gas canisters. With no diesel, the fields can't be irrigated, and the harvest waits. The tourist season ended before it began, and in some villages, people are getting around on horses. And while all this unfolds, what is the Kremlin doing? Nothing. Putin has not made a single comment. In the people's own words, no ferry, no fuel, no buses, no planes, no trains. And Moscow is silent. It is precisely this silence that converts despair into a decision. If the state cannot protect me and has no intention of doing so, why am I still here? And this is no scattered, panicked flight. It is a calculated evacuation. People are selling their belongings or leaving them as they stand, filling the tank with the last of the fuel and heading for Kerch. What truly breaks people isn't the scarcity itself, it's how the scarcity is shared out. The fuel and power remaining on the peninsula are not going to ordinary people. Priority belongs to the army, the security services, and state institutions. In Sevastopol, petrol sales to civilians have been halted entirely. While the ordinary citizen is turned away at the station, vehicles with official plates fill their tanks. This is not a logistical choice, it is a message. The army first, then you. People settled here for years under the assurance that Russia will protect you are being shoved to the back of the line the moment crisis hits. And the question, are we second class, is everywhere. Some of those fleeing cross to the Russian side, to Krasnodar, in search of fuel. The picture there is no different. In the Kuban, petrol riots have effectively broken out. When arrivals from Crimea were denied service at the stations, protests began, fights erupted, Cossacks were posted to guard some stations, and some people even jumped onto fuel trucks. A car with Crimean plates, in other words, is an unwelcome guest on the other side of the strait as well. Even escape opens not onto a safe harbor, but onto a new tension. And in people's eyes, that demolishes the assumption that Russia will take care of us one more time. But the real fracture in this picture is who left first. At the head of the exodus is not the ordinary public. By the reporting of the Atesh Resistance Network and RBC Ukraine, Black Sea Fleet officers began moving their families to Novorossiysk without waiting for official orders and selling the property they couldn't carry. While the "everything is under control" propaganda ran at the front, the families of the people running that propaganda were quietly crossing to the other side. The public noticed, and the panic grew. The occupation administration was reduced to telling people to block accounts claiming to be officers' relatives in the chat groups spreading "the officials have evacuated their families" messages. When a government tells its citizens to silence one another in order to suppress an evacuation rumor, that rumor has long since become fact. And there is more than rumor on the table. By information leaked to powerful Western mainstream outlets and OSINT channels, the Russian authorities have prepared an emergency evacuation plan covering officials, institutions, and families, reaching 250,000 people. Let's put one comment on that leak. 250,000 is nearly a tenth of the peninsula's population of 2,300,000. When a state plans to pull 250,000 people out of land it has proclaimed its own, it no longer believes it can hold that land. That is not the number of a region being cleared, it is the number of a collapse being managed. And this leak cracks open the door to three possibilities for the weeks ahead. The most likely is a controlled evacuation. First the elite, the officers, and the security families, then the critical institutions, saving what is valuable while leaving the public behind. The second, far more dangerous, the flight slipping out of control and turning into mass civilian panic. The 48-kilometer queue at the bridge may be exactly its first sign. The third is the darkest, the compulsory evacuation powers granted by the state of emergency actually coming into force. People no longer facing leaving, but being sent. Whichever comes true, the common denominator doesn't change. A place marketed for years as an untouchable paradise can no longer keep its own population inside. And look at who is fleeing. Most of the settlers Moscow deliberately moved onto the peninsula after 2014. Independent monitoring groups estimate that population at between 800,000 and 1 million. The aim was to make the annexation permanent with a living, working Russian population. Yet 4 years of war, darkness and fear proved enough for them. Now, they are going back the way they came, to hometowns 1,000, some 3,000 kilometers away. Holding territory takes more than soldiers, it takes a people rooted in it. The moment that people runs, the ground of the occupation dissolves. History gives off a strange echo here. In 1920, as the White Army evacuated Crimea, 150,000 people fled by ship. A century later, another evacuation. If you've come this far, liking the video and writing your thoughts below helps this analysis reach far more people. Subscribe if you haven't. Since we're now moving to the military mind behind this exodus, and that mind's final target isn't the public, it's the Russian army itself. The chaos on your screen is not a chain of misfortunes. It is the battlefield result of a military doctrine woven patiently over years. The doctrine's author is no secret, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of US Army Europe. What he has argued for years is this: Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war, but for a power without a navy, assaulting it head-on would mean an unthinkable cost. So there is no need to take Crimea. 2 steps suffice. First, cut every logistical artery feeding the peninsula. Then make it impossible to hold militarily. Time and exhaustion handle the rest. Ukraine has worked this plan stitch by stitch for 4 years. First, the Black Sea Fleet's flagship Moskva was sunk, and the fleet was forced out of open waters. Then the submarines and landing ships in dry dock were struck, and the Kerch Bridge took serious damage for the first time. Long-range systems then pinned Russian forces on the peninsula in place. And in the final phase, a new generation of drones reaching deep behind the front targeted the energy and fuel arteries, effectively severing the peninsula from the mainland. Note the sequence. First, the fleet was driven off, then the air defense was blinded, and only at the end was the power cut. The classic way of taking a fortress, scaling the walls and going in, was never attempted. Its water, its electricity, and its provisions were cut off one by one instead. They didn't bring the fortress down, they made it unlivable inside. And this pressure has a calendar. At the start of summer, Kiev announced a 40-day special operation targeting the peninsula. The counter runs until early August. Setting a specific date and duration maximizes the psychological pressure on the other side. You cannot ignore a running clock, since every day means a concrete loss. And the July NATO summit was placed squarely in the middle of that window, making Crimea's administrative and logistical paralysis this visible while the Allies sat down at the table was a heavy card played onto the diplomatic table. In the summit's shadow, Crimea went from being Russia's greatest trump card to its greatest weakness on display to the world. Former Defense Minister Fedorov's logistics blockade and former intelligence chief Budanov's special operations mind were the two hands that translated this doctrine onto the battlefield. And Fedorov never hid the target. By his description, Crimea is the military base that lets the Russians occupy the south and shift forces east. What was being struck was no holiday resort, but an army's spine. The plan's most critical leg was the sky. After 2014, Russia built one of the densest air defense domes in the world over Crimea. S-300, S-400, and the newest S-500 systems, dozens of Pantsir complexes, powerful radars, a naval cordon of warships across the Kerch Strait. The aim was to stretch an impenetrable shield over the entire region. Ukraine dismantled that shield systematically under the strike pressure that ran through June and July 2026. By Ukraine's figures, 66 air defense components were put out of action across the peninsula, 30 of them mobile launchers, 36 radars. Around Kerch alone, 6 critical radars and 5 missile complexes were lost. Panicking Russian commanders shifted the remaining systems to Sevastopol and Simferopol. The drones found and destroyed them in their new positions too. Moving the defense solved nothing, it only moved the target. With the shield down, the energy campaign deepened. By open-source analysts' accounts, 16 electrical distribution stations were targeted within a single 48-hour window in early July. In the days that followed, the number is said to have climbed past 30. The result? Darkness is no longer an exception, but part of the daily routine. Most of the peninsula gets by on just 8 to 10 hours of electricity a day, meaning 2/3 of every day passes in the dark. Nor are generators an answer, since the diesel to run them has already been cut off from the peninsula. Consider what those numbers mean. The S-400 and S-500 are among Russia's most expensive and most scarcely produced assets. Each one represents years of manufacturing. Losing them at the front is one thing. Losing them in the backyard you declared untouchable, often without their firing a single shot, is something else entirely. Today, Crimea's airspace protection network is largely paralyzed. Even the Kerch Bridge, the medal of a 12-year victory, stands exposed, stripped of its layered shield. This was the thing protecting the Russian army in Crimea, and it no longer exists. In a fortress whose walls have fallen, all that remains is a garrison trapped inside. And the reason the blows can now land straight on the heart including that power plant strike you saw in Section 1, is exactly this. The shield is gone. So if the sky is this open, why doesn't Ukraine simply destroy the Kerch Bridge outright? The bridge is the plan's final piece. Robert Brovdy, Magyar, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, said it without a shred of evasion. Destroying the bridge is not the priority. The aim is to create conditions that make staying on the peninsula unbearable, so that the occupiers withdraw across that bridge and go. This is a deliberate inversion of military logic. Normally, you destroy the bridge and trap the enemy. A sealed Crimea, though, means a garrison forced to fight to its last soldier. An open Crimea is an evacuation channel through which a demoralized population and the officers' families quietly drain away. And one detail gives away how deliberate this strategy is. The Kerch ferry terminal, the gate for leaving by sea, took heavy damage in a night airstrike and is effectively out of service. The sea route was closed, the land route left open. That is no coincidence, it is channeling. All exit traffic is being deliberately funneled into a single canal, the bridge. Yet the same detail shows the other face of the coin. As long as the bridge stays functional, this is an escape route. Should that colossal structure one day lose its function, the same route becomes a trap overnight. For the hundreds of thousands still inside, the equation at that moment stops being leaving and becomes being stuck. Everyone in Crimea knows this, and it is one reason the queues run so long. No one trusts that the door will stay open forever. Military history has a name for this. A besieged enemy is deliberately left one way out, since a force that knows it can flee resists less than a force that knows it is cornered. Budanov's message to the Ukrainians of the peninsula points at the same goal. All of today's hardships serve one great purpose, and that purpose is coming home. Now put all the pieces together. The plan's ultimate target was never the public. The people's departure was the insect. The target, from the very beginning, was the Russian army itself. And that target is being reached. The Russian army has begun to leave Crimea. The signs are stacking up. By Atesh's sources inside the fleet, plans are being drawn up to move the Black Sea Fleet's command structures from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Some officers are already relocating without waiting for the order. The fleet's ships were pulled from open waters to Novorossiysk years ago. Now it is the headquarters' turn. When an army's ships are gone and its command is going, what remains behind is not a force, it is a signboard. Military logic permits no other conclusion either. Three things make a base: its power, its supply, and the shield guarding its sky. In Crimea, all three have collapsed. Its electricity is gone 2/3 of the day, its fuel is scarce enough to be shut off from civilians, its air defense has been dismantled. The peninsula Fedorov called a military base is now a base without a function, and no army sits forever on a base without a function. If it does, the outcome is written. A target board, unsupplied and unshielded, wearing down a little more each day. Alongside the army, the state apparatus is packing up as well. By the information being relayed, occupation administrations have been instructed to move critical documents and databases off the peninsula. Several senior officials are alleged to have hurried to the mainland citing sudden health problems. Those charged with protecting the region being the first to leave it is, as of July, no longer an isolated incident. It is an institutional pattern of behavior. And for the Kremlin, this is an inescapable geo-economic trap. Crimea is the focal point of the regime's political legitimacy. Giving up its defense means pulling out the load-bearing column of the system. Yet the cost of keeping it standing passed the limits of sustainability long ago. A permanent defensive posture, endless repair spending, a bill that grows every week. It cannot let go, it cannot hold on, and the dilemma deepens by the day. This is the final act of the Hodges plan. They turned the fortress into a cage. Now they hold the cage door open and wait for what's inside to walk out on its own feet. And the walkout has begun. First the tourists went, then the public, then the officers' families, now the command structures and the state archives. There is no need even to say what the next link in this chain is. Looked at from Moscow's own side, the picture is the same. Even Solovyov, one of Putin's most loyal propagandists, let slip on live television that construction of the barriers meant to protect the bridge had stopped for lack of money. And the heaviest admission came from Leonid Ivashov, retired Colonel General and one of the doyens of Russian imperial thought. Currently in Crimea himself, Ivashov, in remarks being circulated, said it outright. Unfortunately, day by day, little by little, Crimea is ceasing to be ours. Not a Ukrainian official, the Kremlin's own man, standing on the land they occupy, saying, "This is no longer ours." When a regime's most loyal voices begin to talk this way, the crack has run far beneath the surface. This whole picture is powerful, yet it demands a step back and a cool head. The excitement of the footage can pull you toward the wrong conclusion. None of this means Crimea falls tomorrow. Most of the population is still there, the bridge still stands, and taking Crimea back militarily exceeds the present means of a Ukraine without a navy or an amphibious force. Declaring that the regime falls tomorrow would be just as hasty. By US intelligence assessments, Russia approaches the nuclear threshold only when the regime's existence is under threat, and a fuel crisis sits far from that threshold. What's more, a cornered Putin may become not more pliant, but more dangerous. He can be expected to take Crimea's pain out on Ukrainian cities with even more missiles. The latest strikes on Kiev already show the heavy civilian price of that. So let's name what we are seeing correctly. This is not a military collapse. It is a political and psychological earthquake. Crimea is turning from a fortress into a trap for Putin. Too symbolic to abandon, too exposed to use, too expensive to normalize. And every indicator, the 48-kilometer queue, the second-class treatment, the elite's flight, the 250,000 leak, the collapsed shield, the relocating headquarters, points to the same place. The peninsula is becoming untenable for the Russians. Symbolically, this is a demolition. Crimea was the foundation of Putin's myth as the leader who brought the empire back. Now a crack is running through that foundation, driven by the flight of the very people he moved there. Strategically, it is a reversal. The place that was once the safest prize has become the Kremlin's most expensive burden. And that calls the purpose of the entire special military operation into question. If in the end even the population you transplanted is fleeing, what was all this destruction for? Psychologically, it is the most lasting of all. In an autocracy, the appearance of power is power itself. A fortress declared unconquerable, failing to find the electricity to light its own citizens' homes, erases that aura of invincibility. And if even an empire's safest place is unsafe, the inevitable question falls into Russian society's mind. Then where else is safe? That is what truly frightens Moscow. Not the peninsula itself, but the message its fall carries. And that message has one more addressee: the Russian soldier at the front. A soldier waiting in a trench in the Donbass who hears that the unshakable base behind him is emptying, that the officers' families left long ago, that the commander has moved his headquarters, begins to question the meaning of his own war as well. Armies fight not only with ammunition, but with belief. And every image leaking out of Crimea gnaws at that belief a little more. Which is why the queue at the Kerch Bridge is really a billboard standing hundreds of kilometers behind the front and addressing all of it. From here, the beginning of the end is visible. Magyar's words gather the entire strategy into one sentence. We are isolating Crimea, closing the roads that lead in, not the ones that lead out. There is only one reason the bridge still stands, so the occupiers can withdraw and go. 12 years ago, Putin proclaimed Crimea to the world as the crown of my victory. Today, that crown is melting under an unprotected sky, in cities without electricity, in the escape lines before a single bridge. Putin is still standing, but Crimea surrendered before he did. Its people on the roads, its elites beyond the strait, its army turned toward the exit. Putin took Crimea as the crown of his victory, and in the summer of 2026, that crown was left in the dark, behind those who fled. Do you think this flight from Crimea is a genuine turning point in the war, or will Putin manage to ride out this crisis too? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's exclusive war and technology analyses, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.
Sabre, on my call, deliver at rate!
As of July 2026, a serious shift in momentum is underway on the front. Ukraine has launched surprise counterattacks on several axes, and Russia is now plainly struggling to hold the line in a few key directions. In West Zaporizhia, toward Kamyanska and Plavny, Russian positions are being pushed back. Around Lyman, the grey zone is expanding, step by step, in Ukraine's favor. And in Donetsk, Kostiantynivka, the city Putin announced 3 days ago, on July 3rd, that Russia had taken, is still in Ukrainian hands, and a Ukrainian jet even struck its very center.
The liberation of Konstantinovka is of great strategic importance.
For months, the side advancing was Russia. Now the initiative is changing hands. Putin's uneasy expression isn't accidental either. The picture his own chain of command feeds him broke away from reality long ago, and in all likelihood, no one knows that better than he does. The gap between the propaganda maps Russia manufactures with its flag planting and infiltration tactics and the real situation on the ground widens by the day. We'll look, step by step, at why Russia can't advance with a huge army, while Ukraine, with a far smaller force, has seized the initiative. But first, a small request. Independent frontline analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd be interested. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It only takes a few seconds. Now let's start where the advance is clearest, West Zaporizhia. This is the sector where Ukraine has made its most concrete gains since early July. By military observer Kostyantin Mashovetz's July 5th assessment, Ukrainian forces fully cleared Primorska, seized the critical road junction between Primorska and Stepnohirsk, the intersection analysts call Circle, and gained a solid foothold in Plavny, south of Stepnohirsk. And the gain isn't confined to a single point. From Stena, liberated months ago, the grey zone is expanding step by step. By the latest field data, Ukraine has also crossed the small local river near Stepnohirsk and taken one more crossroad critical for supply. And if the trend holds, the next stop could be the town of Kamyanska. And here's the crucial part. On this front, Russia was the one meant to attack. The 58th Army and its supporting units, roughly approximately 150,000 troops, expected to launch the next major wave in the Zaporizhia direction, had been preparing for months. But Ukraine's intense fire pressure and assault tempo over recent weeks suddenly locked that mass onto the defensive. In Mashovetz's words, these units are now in no shape even to launch the next wave, since Ukraine turned Moscow's own plan against Moscow. Russia's intent was to press from Huliai-Pole and Orikhiv at once, envelop Ukraine's east-west defensive line from the flank rather than head-on, and from there march on the city of Zaporizhia. But the very moves that came on those two axes, Primorska, Circle, and Plavny, wrapped that pincer around Russia's own neck before it could close. So the 58th Guards Army was forced to pull back its main forces and shift to active defense. The backbone of the Russian force in this sector is the 58th Guards Combined Arms Army, Dnieper Group, under the Southern Military District. By OSINT assessments, it includes formations such as the 42nd Motor Rifle Division and the 136th Guards Brigade. The wider grouping is reinforced with elite airborne, VDV, and naval infantry elements. The task force in direct contact along the Kamyanska-Plavny line is estimated at roughly 6,000 to 12,000 troops, not a precise count, an observer estimate. Under Ukraine's electronic warfare and drone pressure, this force's supply and maneuver are badly constrained. The advance at Primorska also put the Vasilivka logistics hub under threat and sharply narrowed the Dnieper Group's freedom of movement in the area. What it means is this: the pincer Russia spent months trying to build was turned back against it. The army meant to attack became a defensive force trying to protect its own flanks. Holding a single road junction like Circle can close off a whole army's option to open westward. This is exactly why, on the modern front, it isn't ground, but the nodal points that are decisive. Russia held limited positions at spots like Nestoryanka Novoandriivka, but by Mashovets, Its attempts to reach the dominant heights west of Orikhiv failed, and the infiltrating groups were left exposed and cleared. The footage from the ground bears this out. The July 5th General Staff report notes that an enemy assault near Plavny in the Orikhiv direction was repelled, while at M0 Stas's same-day summary of Mashovets sums it up in one line. The 58th Army pulled from offense to defense, Primorska cleared, a foothold gained in Plavny. So how does Ukraine stop a far more numerous army here? At the heart of the answer is an element invisible on most maps: electronic warfare. The model works like this. First, long-range reconnaissance drones watch Russian positions around the clock. Then FPV and drop drones, the Baba Yaga type, come into play. But the real decider is the electronic warfare umbrella protecting those drones. Ukrainian forces actively use jammers that break the control signals and video links of Russian FPV drones. Against Russia's Lancet and fiber-optic drones, frequency hopping and signal jamming techniques are in play. The effect on the ground is clear. Russian drone operators can't effectively track or target Ukrainian infantry, while Ukraine flies its own FPV and drop drones under this EW cover, opening far safer corridors. The Russians try to answer with EW too, but thanks to Ukraine's small yet agile drone fleet and frequency diversity, the pressure stays on the Russian side. In short, this invisible front neutralizes most of Russia's infiltration groups before they even reach a building. And the strategic meaning is large. On the modern front, the side that controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the drones, and the side that controls the drones controls the open ground. With this edge, Ukraine renders much of Russia's numerical superiority meaningless, since a crowd that can't see and can't target isn't a real force on the ground. This is exactly where the two armies' methods diverge. Once the drone and EW preparation is done, Ukraine moves to small-scale infantry infiltration. At squad or platoon level, groups of 8 to 30 enter buildings and basements under the drone corridor. The aim isn't planting a flag for propaganda, but consolidation. The area entered goes immediately under drone surveillance and EW cover. A safe corridor is opened for reinforcement, and trench improvements begin in the captured buildings. This silent advance is the fruit of the lesson Ukraine drew from its 2023 mistake. The big counteroffensive announced months ahead launched in the most expected direction and stalled for exactly that reason. Russia does the opposite. Small reconnaissance sabotage groups enter a village and film a video planting a Russian flag. Since the Russian army's #1 priority isn't holding ground, but producing a "we're winning" image. That way, Gerasimov can paint the official Defense Ministry maps a little redder and present it to the higher command as a success. Yet because of Ukraine's drone and EW dominance, these groups are mostly destroyed or can't consolidate what they hold. Ukraine, for its part, deliberately stays quiet about its gains. Even its own open-source map, Deep State, often shows these advances late. The reason is practical. The Russian High Command often learns of a Ukrainian move from Ukrainian telegram channels faster than from its own lower-level commanders, since the commander who reports a withdrawal is usually the one who takes the blame, and no one wants to bring bad news to the top. This difference between the two methods reflects two different priorities. Russia prioritizes the appearance of victory. Ukraine prioritizes victory itself and the lives of its soldiers. And the sustainable one, over time, is the second. If an army can't replace every infantryman it spends, that image collapses sooner or later. A quick break. Independent frontline analysis like this is suppressed by the algorithm too. Your like, a one-word comment, and your subscription directly help the video reach far more people, since we're now moving to the place where Putin's biggest claim collapsed, Kostiantynivka. Now to Donetsk, where Putin's biggest claim fell apart. His July 3rd, "the city is captured" claim was thoroughly disproven by ISW's July 3rd to 7th reports. In reality, the city is largely a grey zone. Ukraine's 19th Army Corps holds an active presence in the center and north, while the Russian presence is limited to small infiltration groups. By Ukrainian military sources, as of mid-June, the number of Russian troops inside the city was between 100 and 250, enough to infiltrate, not to fully capture a city. The most concrete proof the city is still under Ukrainian control came on July 5th. A Ukrainian MiG-29 with 2 French-made AASM Hammer-guided bombs struck a building used by Russian drone operators in the industrial zone at Kostiantynivka's center. Ukraine's Air Force called it a devastating blow to the drone operator's position. The logic here matters. That Russian drone operators could set up in that neighborhood shows Russian assault units had gained a foothold in that part of the city, but Ukraine's air and fire dominance can strike that position at once. And there's a larger meaning. If Ukraine can still fly a jet over the center of a city Russia says it has taken and strike its drone operators, that claim is an empty phrase, with no answer on the ground. The 19th Army Corps also stated that defensive operations continue on the designated lines and approaches. Zelensky, on July 4th, rejected the claim as a lie manufactured for the media and demolished it in one line. If it's really under your control, come, let's meet there. Russia, meanwhile, keeps sending groups of 2 to 5 into buildings to film flag videos. The goal, again, is propaganda and map painting. As for the balance of forces, the main Russian effort is right here. By ISW, at least 1 combined arms army, 1 army corps, and more than 4 other army elements support this axis. While only small infiltration groups are inside the city, on the broader Kostiantynivka-Drushkivka axis, the main Russian effort on the Eastern Front, the Russian force is assessed at approximately 20,000 to 40,000 plus troops. But because of Ukraine's drone dominance, this mass advances at high cost and very slowly. Kostiantynivka matters so much for a strategic reason. The city is one of the key nodes of the fortress belt holding Donbass. The whole aim of Russia's summer offensive was to take this city, break that belt, and then push towards Slovyansk and Kramatorsk to collapse Ukraine's eastern front. So the stall here disrupts not just one city, but Russia's entire summer plan. And the real danger here isn't the propaganda itself, but its consequence. The Russian High Command makes its decisions looking at these fake maps. It sends reinforcements to positions that are actually Ukrainian-held or in the grey zone. When those units reach a point that looks friendly on the map, but is really under Ukrainian fire, they're caught unprepared and take heavy losses. So the lie turns in time into an operational error in which the Russian command burns through its own soldiers. As of July 8th, the city remains under Ukrainian control. Russian reconnaissance sabotage groups are trying to infiltrate points to the west, such as Mykolaipilia. Lyman shows a similar picture. Russia's 20th and 25th Army elements attempt infiltration on the eastern outskirts, but Ukraine holds the grey zone. More than that, it's expanding the grey zone in its favor toward Nova/Novokarivka and Lipova. Russian flag operations are repelled and infiltration groups cleared with FPVs. So much so that even Russian mill bloggers, who once painted Lyman fully red, now show it as a grey zone and speak anxiously of Ukrainian counterattack vectors running from Rydkudub towards Zelena Dolina and Shadrigalova, which means a threat to cut the flanks of the Russian grouping around Lyman. But what really makes the Zaporizhia front fragile lies much farther south, the collapse of Crimea's logistics. Ukraine's long-range drone strikes on Crimea, the Kerch ferries, transformer substations, airfields and bridges, hit Russian supply lines directly. Damage to the ferry routes slows heavy vehicle and ammunition transport. Strikes on substations disrupt power and communications infrastructure, and airfield strikes limit the mobility of Russian aviation in the area. The routes carrying materiel to Zaporizhia, and the southern front in particular, are broken up this way. The result? The 58th Army's supply strain in the Kamyanska sector deepens, its maneuver drops, and that directly eases Ukraine's counterattack. So Ukraine weakens a front in the south by cutting the arteries of a peninsula hundreds of kilometers to the rear. And this shows the whole southern front hangs on a single vulnerability. Crimea is the windpipe of Russia's operations in the south. As that pipe narrows, a division's ammunition, fuel and air support in Zaporizhia all melt away. Ukraine's strategy rests on exactly this logic. Rather than trying to beat the army head-on at the front, sever the logistical arteries that keep it standing, from much farther back and far more cheaply. A force stationed on a peninsula, no matter how large, is only as strong as it can be supplied. So how many Russian soldiers are really being ground down under all this pressure? Let's gather the picture front by front and put the key numbers up front. On the southern front, in the Zaporizhia direction, the approximately 150,000 strong 58th Army Group, readied for the offensive, is now locked on defense. Some 6,000 to 12,000 of them are in direct contact with Ukrainian fire along the Kamyanska-Plavny line. On the eastern front, in Donbass, the main Russian effort concentrates on the Kostiantynivka-Druzhkivka axis. Here, approximately 20,000 to 40,000 plus troops are trying to advance at heavy cost, while only 100 to 250 infiltrators are inside the city itself. Russia's 20th and 25th Army elements are also active on the Lyman axis. Across all these sectors, the Russian force in direct combat under Ukrainian pressure is approximately 25,000 to 60,000 troops. And the truly striking number is this. The total Russian force in the field is approximately 700,000 troops, a Ukrainian General Staff estimate. Here is where the real point hides, in that bigger picture. Even after the counterattacks began, Russian troop levels stayed the same. No reinforcements arrived, no rotation happened, since Moscow had no reserves left to send. And the chain ISW calls the cascading effect kicks in right here. Pressure in Zaporizhia forces the Russian command to shift elite units, airborne, VDV, and naval infantry elements included, from other axes like Pokrovsk, Kostiantynivka, and Lyman. For an army with no reserves, that means growing a little thinner everywhere, with losses exceeding recruitment for months. Keeping a whole assault army on the defensive also eats up the force needed to advance elsewhere. The real question on the ground isn't who has more soldiers, but who holds the initiative. When Ukraine bears down on one point and forces Russia to shift units there, a gap opens somewhere else on the front, and there's no reserve to plug it at the same moment. This is the essence of asymmetry. With a far smaller force, Ukraine renders a far larger Russian mass immobile and reactive. Note too that figures like approximately 150,000 and approximately 700,000 above are Ukrainian and observer estimates, and that the thinning is an inference, not a precise number. So why can't Russia hold, despite all this force? The real answer is in the numbers, since this whole tactical picture is part of one big trend. In 2025, Russia was taking, on average, 440 square kilometers a month. In the first half of 2026, that dropped to 15 to 30 square kilometers a month. Indeed, by CSIS data, April to May saw a net loss of nearly 400 square kilometers. The daily pace fell from 9.76 square kilometers to 2.9 in the year's first third, to a third. Against that, the cost ballooned. In April alone, Russian casualties passed 35,000. Losses have exceeded recruitment for 5 months. Since February 2022, total casualties have reached roughly 1.4 million, with those who have lost their lives at about 450,000. Ukraine's General Staff puts total Russian losses above 1.4 million. CSIS's assessment is clear. Russia has lost the military initiative. The takeaway is this. Russia now spends tens of thousands of soldiers each month for roughly a neighborhood or two of ground, and in places loses more than it takes. This isn't an advancing army. It's an army melting in place. When all this data comes together, the picture becomes clear. Ukraine's Kamyanska-Plavny breakthrough, the jet strike at Kostiantynivka, and its resistance there clearly show that Russia's 2026 summer campaign has lost momentum. Russia still advances slowly in some spots, but it can't consolidate what it holds. Its logistical vulnerabilities are growing, and it's falling behind in the drone war. In Zaporizhia, the 58th Army pulled back to defense. In Kostiantynivka, its in-city presence stayed limited to a few hundred infiltrators. Ukraine, for its part, is making effective, low-profile, but result-producing counters with limited resources. And, most important, it protects its soldiers. Since Ukraine is not Russia, it tries to win by using its people wisely, not by spending them. The gap between the propaganda maps and ground reality widens by the day, which drives the Russian command toward wrong decisions, sending reinforcements to positions that don't exist. What all this means for the course of the war is this. Russia's 2026 summer offensive has become the name for losing blood and resources more than gaining ground. An army that can't decide the matter on the ground can't strike a winner's pose at the negotiating table either. And as the gap between these two realities widens, the initiative begins to change hands for good. The timing is telling too. This stall coincides with a period right after the NATO summit, when Russia wants to strengthen its hand at the table. So the failure on the ground feeds directly into the diplomatic balance as well. The situation can change by the hour, but the current trend has clearly gained momentum in Ukraine's favor. So how do you read this picture? Can Russia sustain this tempo without a new mobilization, or is the front turning permanently in Ukraine's favor? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's exclusive analyses like this, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us. For Putin, victory is no longer a choice, but a necessity. In a war going on more than 4 years, he's looking for something concrete to show his people, a "this is what we fought for" moment. And the prize he's declared is clear. The goal the Kremlin has repeated again and again, all of Donbass, the final liberation of Donetsk and the south. For Putin, this is a political matter more than a military one. An operation billed as "over in 3 days" has entered its 5th year, and the regime knows that carrying this cost without a victory to show the public gets harder by the month. Indeed, in May 2026, Putin scaled back the traditional Victory Day parade, both out of concern over Ukraine's long-range strikes and because of the squeeze at the front. Even the show of strength is now at risk. And Putin's entire war plan rested on a single assumption: numerical superiority. A vast population, tens of millions of young men, the belief that whatever the losses, the front can always be refilled. It's a habit that runs from Stalin's day to now. Mass instead of calculated maneuver, treating human life as an expendable resource. But in 2026, that assumption is cracking. Putin is hunting for men, multiplying bonuses, threatening prison, recruiting mercenaries from dozens of countries. And for the first time, a nation of 146 million isn't answering fast enough. The mass he counted on isn't turning into substance at the front. And this is Russia's real problem. No longer the ground it loses or fails to take, but its inability to replace what it loses. By the figures, the Russian army burns through roughly 2.5 battalions worth of men every day, while what replaces them steadily shrinks. An army like that doesn't collapse in a day, it empties out quietly from within. Today, some units are fighting at just a third of their paper strength. And a single number we'll work out in this video sums up the whole story. Over the past 6 months, Russia built the army it needed to cover its losses fully 50 battalions short. 50 battalions that should exist on paper, but never reached the front. We'll see, number by number, how that 50 battalion gap formed in a moment. But first, a small favor. Independent war and technology analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd want it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that. It takes only a few seconds. Now back to the story of those missing battalions. To understand this, you have to look closely at what Russia sends to the front. There are roughly 4 kinds of battalion, and each serves a different purpose. At the front, the most consumed class, the Storm, and Assault battalions. Their strength runs a net 200 to 400 men, but the figure keeps shifting. Heavy losses force constant replenishment. They're filled with ex-convicts, mercenaries, and specially selected contract soldiers. Armor support is minimal, and their job is to infiltrate in small groups and wear down Ukrainian defenses with human wave tactics. The logic is cold and simple. Without risking expensive armor or trained soldiers, use cheap infantry to probe the enemy's drone and minefield belt and draw the defense's fire. Losses aren't an anomaly, they're the plan. The second class, the body that supplies the numbers, volunteer and reserve regional motorized infantry battalions. Their strength runs a net 400 to 500. Made up of volunteers gathered from Russia's 85 federal regions and men taken in through partial mobilization, they're low on technical kit and training. most thrown into the field after a 30-day course. Their tasks are to hold the lines the storm battalions take, protect logistics, and defend across a broad front. This is the type produced most to supply the front with sheer crowd. The third class, scarce and prized, the VDV, airborne, and naval infantry battalions. Their strength runs a net 350 to 500, trained, professional, high capability. And the fourth class, the new generation, unmanned systems and specialist technical battalions. A net 200 to 300 specialist personnel. These don't fight on the line directly. They give the storm battalions FPV kamikaze drone support, run electronic warfare, and do reconnaissance. They're the most protected, highest quality class in the army right now. Who gets lost confirms the picture too. Most documented Russian casualties are motorized infantry, that expendable body. Of 229,000 documented deaths, about 13% are motorized infantry, while the elite VDV's share is around 2.5%. In some sectors, it's even claimed that, against Ukraine's improving drone capability, a Russian soldier's average time on the field has dropped to 20 to 35 minutes. And the real constraint is this. You can mass-produce expendable manpower quickly, but building quality troops, pilots, drone operators, VDV, takes years. The more Russia loses, the lower its army's average quality falls. So it isn't only the numbers melting, but the quality. It sends its cheapest people to its most dangerous places. And as we're about to see, even those people are running out. Now let's work out step by step how those 50 battalions vanished. In the first half of 2026, the Russian army lost more than 180,000 soldiers. By the figures from Zelensky and Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, more than 86,000 of them lost their lives, the rest wounded too badly to fight. Spread over 6 months, that's an average of 1,000 soldiers a day. Measured against a net 400-man assault battalion, Russia burns through roughly 2.5 battalions worth of men every day. Against that, recruitment lags far behind. Per Ukrainian intelligence, Russia hit only 22% of its 409,000 target for 2026 in the first quarter, about 80,000 people. Carried over 6 months, that's roughly 160,000 new soldiers, a bit over 2 battalions a day, and falling. Now let's take the shortfall. Over 6 months, 180,000 soldiers melted away, and only 160,000 were put in their place. The net gap is 20,000 soldiers. Divide that by a net 400-man assault battalion, 50 battalions. So Russia built the army it needed to cover its losses 50 battalions short. 50 battalions that should exist on paper, but never reach the front. The absence of a whole army. As a daily average, that's a quiet leak of about 110 men a day. It looks small, but it compounds every day. And the gap isn't steady, it's accelerating. By June, daily losses climbed to 1,300, while recruitment held at 900. The net gap leapt to 400 a day, nearly a full assault battalion. To make it concrete, in December 2025, in a single month, Russia lost more men than the Soviet Union did in 10 years in Afghanistan. The cost of a 10-year war now fits into 1 month, and no wave of mobilization can close that pace. By Al Jazeera's account, the daily recruitment target was 1,100 to 1,150, while the actual rate was 940. If that holds, the shortfall reaches 65,000 by year's end, another whole force, on paper alone. Russia's deployed strength holds at around 700,000, but that stability comes not from successful recruitment, but from draining strategic reserves at the bottom. And to close the gap, Russia reaches for ever more vulnerable groups. A large share of new recruits comes from debtors, convicts, and men lured by amnesty offers. Universities are handed student contract quotas, and regional governments are pressed to nominate employees. An army scraping the very bottom is a sign that the surface has run out. The myth of numerical superiority is now running on debt. So what does Russia get for this price? Almost nothing. In June, the army lost 39,500 soldiers to seize or infiltrate about 30 square kilometers. Roughly 1,300 casualties per square kilometer, an exchange 19 times worse than the same month a year earlier. In April, on the Donetsk axis, it spent 25,000 soldiers to advance 53 square kilometers. That's 470 men for a single square kilometer. The Russian army took Avdiivka in February 2024 and Pokrovsk in January 2026. But after Pokrovsk, the advance nearly stopped, only a few tens of kilometers westward. This year's total gain isn't even a quarter of the same period last year. And perhaps most striking, in April and May, for the first time since 2024, Russia lost more ground than it gained. The exchange rate tells the same story. For most of the war, 2 or 3 Russian casualties fell for every Ukrainian. In the first half of 2026, that ratio rose to about 8 to 1, and in some sectors climbed as high as 27 to 1 in December. The main driver of that gap is drones. They account for roughly 90% of Russian casualties. Russia hasn't even updated its own casualty count since September 2022. The official figure is still under 6,000, while independent tallies have confirmed more than 200,000 names. That silence is itself an admission that the number is unacceptable. The machine still runs, but it no longer advances. It grinds itself down. Having an army is one thing, getting somewhere with it is another, and Russia's machine can't do the second. Now to the real question. Can Putin take Donbass at this tempo? The numbers are merciless. Russia's rate of advance in the first half of 2026 was about 1 square kilometer a day, some 600 square kilometers in all over 6 months. Yet what remains, the Ukrainian-held Donbass, the fortified belt taking in Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Kostyantynivka, is several thousand square kilometers of the most fortified ground on the continent. At 1 square kilometer a day, that's the work not of months but of years, probably 5 or more. And at today's price, at 470 to 1,300 casualties per square kilometer, taking that ground would cost millions of soldiers, more than Russia has lost in the entire war so far. Make it concrete. Just to grind toward a single city in that belt, Kostyantynivka, Russia has thrown in the better part of a combined arms army and an army corps, plus elements of 4 more armies. Taking the whole belt would demand many times that, dozens of fresh battalions. At the very moment it's running 50 battalions short. And that belt is no ordinary line. A defensive zone woven and layered over more than a decade. Even ISW doesn't consider a rapid operational breakout there likely. So Putin has 2 options. Grind on for years at today's pace, at a cost he can't bear, or declare a victory he hasn't won and come to the table. Both collapse his final liberation narrative. Indeed, commanders had promised to take all of Donbass by autumn. Instead, the spring offensive stalled at 100,000 casualties, and the gap between the promise and the reality widened every week. For perspective, since 2023, 3 years, Russia has taken only 1% of Ukraine's territory. Taking the rest of Donbass at this pace may not, mathematically, even fit inside Putin's lifetime. The arithmetic runs out before the map does. A quick break. Independent war analysis like this is suppressed by the algorithm. A like, a one-word comment, and a subscribe directly help this video reach far more people. Since we're about to turn to the other side of the coin, Ukraine's tempo, and how the Russian army now looks to the rest of the world. And the other side of the equation is moving against Russia too. Ukraine is no longer just defending. In April and May, it retook a net 400+ square kilometers, Russia's first net territorial loss since 2024. Ukraine's countermove this spring landed at exactly the Russian army's weakest moment and gained real ground in the south. Drones now account for roughly 90% of Russian casualties on the field, and Ukraine's deep strike campaign, hitting refineries, satellite centers, and logistics reaching as far as Mariupol, is turning occupied territory into unsafe ground for the Russian army. So, on one side, an army losing momentum, buying every square kilometer at a rising price. On the other, an army whose reach is widening, taking the initiative. Ukraine takes losses too, and its cities are struck. But the strategic equation shows, for the first time in a long while, that time is working for Kyiv. These two curves aren't heading the same way, they're heading in opposite directions. The logic of this reversal on the ground also lies in the technology. Ukraine has built a drone wall kilometers deep. The moment Russian infantry enters that zone, they're spotted and struck, and the advance is measured in meters. The same drones both wove the defense and opened the door to the counterattack. And Ukraine's reach lengthens a little more every month. New generation drones from companies like Firepoint can now reach more than 2,000 kilometers inside, as far as the Tumen refinery in western Siberia. By Zelensky, the range will go beyond 3,000 kilometers. Add to that the domestically built Flamingo cruise missile with its 1,150-kilogram warhead. And the effect of these deep strikes feeds straight back to the front. By Western analysts, as the flow of fuel and ammunition is cut, Russia's capacity to attack weakens too. So Ukraine isn't just retaking ground, it's severing, one by one, the pipes that feed the Russian war machine. Open the picture to the whole front, and the breaking points piling up since New Year are everywhere. In Donbass, Pokrovsk fell in January, but the advance died there. Kostiantynivka has turned into a meat grinder for 1 square kilometer a day. In the south, Crimea is being besieged from within. Severed roads, a fuel crisis, and a state of emergency declared on the peninsula on June 26th. And in Russia's own depth, the war has now come home. Refineries burning, a satellite communications center hit twice in a single week, missile plants targeted. The fuel crisis has deepened so far that the rear's logistics are unraveling on one side, while Moscow's scramble to protect its own skies grows on the other. The arteries keeping the war alive are strained all at once. From Crimea to Donbass to inside Russia, the same pattern repeats. An army thinner every month, trying to reach more places at once. The command that said at New Year, "We'll finish Donbass this year," is, 6 months on, losing more than it gains. The June tally of this war come home is concrete. By Ukraine's defense ministry, in June alone, 11 Russian refineries and more than 8 defense industry sites were struck at ranges exceeding 2,000 kilometers. Among them, a plant in Voronezh that makes components for Kh-101 cruise missiles and Pantsir systems. The Moscow refinery alone supplied 40% of the capital's fuel, and its repair is said to take at least 3 months. Ordinary Russians now feel the result. About a third of Russia's oil refining capacity is offline. Gasoline has been rationed in dozens of regions. Hours-long car queues have formed, and in Irkutsk in Siberia, a limit of 50 liters per vehicle per day was imposed. On June 28th, Putin admitted something he had long papered over. The country faces a temporary deficit. For one of the world's largest energy producers, this became the moment that brought the war to more ordinary people's doors than ever before. And in the south, Crimea grew tighter still. Fuel facilities on both sides of the Kerch Strait were struck, civilian fuel sales on the peninsula were halted, and transport between the peninsula and the mainland was cut. And in this picture, Russia's helplessness turns into a vicious circle. To stop the deep strikes, it pulled its most valuable air defense systems, S-400, S-500 and Pantsir launchers, off the front and massed them over Moscow and the Kerch Bridge. By Zelensky, hundreds of launchers went to the Moscow region alone. But that left the front and other directions exposed. So a nuclear power can't fully protect its front, its capital, or Crimea all at once. Every move leaves somewhere else defenseless. And so the story that began with Battalion math arrives at the same place. It isn't only men that are running short. Now everything can no longer reach everywhere at once. So how much longer can the Russian army and the Russian people carry all this? Russia has a historically high tolerance threshold, authoritarian control, tight propaganda, and a system that covers over its losses. The Kremlin suppresses dissent with laws that treat criticizing the army as disparaging the armed forces and blacks out casualty news. Indeed, in 2026, the budget for state media was raised by about 54%. That extra effort, spent to prop up the "victory is inevitable" narrative, is itself a sign the regime is struggling to hold the perception together. But the burden is distributed anything but evenly. The casualties fall not on Moscow or St. Petersburg, but on the poorest, mostly ethnic minority regions: Buryatia, Tuva, Dagestan. In prisoner exchanges, ethnic Russians are prioritized, while minority soldiers are held longer at the front. That builds a quiet but mounting anger on the country's periphery. And this year something changed. Ukraine's tempo brought the war to the ordinary Russian's door for the first time. The economy is tightening, prices and taxes are rising, the internet is being restricted. On top of that, Moscow and St. Petersburg are struck by drones, Crimea's beaches and camps are closing, and power cuts are added to fuel lines. A distant war is easy to endure, but when the gas line, the grocery receipt and the drone reach your own city, the abstract suddenly turns personal. Can the Russian people endure is the wrong question. The real one is, how much longer, and where the breaking point lies. This picture reads differently from outside Russia too. For years, the world feared the Russian army as an unstoppable force, the army supposedly reaching Kiev in 3 days. This year, that image cracked. Western analysts now speak plainly. By CSIS, Russia has lost the military initiative. Figures like Mick Ryan argue Putin is losing in every dimension: military, economic, industrial, and moral. And Kaufman says that, whatever the cost paid, an operational breakout is impossible. The consequences are strategic. In the Black Sea, Russia is no longer a serious naval power. Its fleet has been driven back. And Europe is hardening against a Russia that has lost its deterrent, taking over command of the eastern flank, financing Ukraine's drone industry, launching a defense mobilization worth up to 800 billion euros under Rearm Europe. Russia's standing as a great military power, and its image as an arms exporter, is taking damage. Its rivals see it too. The war it launched to project strength has turned Russia into the dependent partner, leaning on China, North Korea and Iran, buying what it can't produce. By RUSI, even those partners can't close the gap in equipment and ammunition. So Moscow is drifting increasingly toward hybrid warfare, sabotage and influence operations. In short, what the world sees is no longer an invincible army. It's an army that, while trying to project strength, has exposed its weakness to friend and foe alike. To be honest, this doesn't mean Russia collapses tomorrow. The country still leans on a vast population, keeps striking cities, and can carry this tempo a while longer. By CSIS, though its casualties since February 2022 have neared 1.5 million, and its dead approach 450,000, it still has a pool of manpower left. But the one thing Putin's whole war rested on, the belief that a nation of 140 million can always outnumber the enemy, is exactly what's collapsing. Bonuses have hit record highs, reaching tens of thousands of dollars in some regions. But money, threats and propaganda can't turn that curve. To declare victory, he needs Donbass. For Donbass, he needs an army the arithmetic no longer lets him field. Every day, a battalion's worth of men is struck from the ledger and doesn't come back. Putin is asking a nation of 146 million for more soldiers, and for the first time in history, the nation can't raise them fast enough. And a cornered power usually doesn't step back. It tries to win back the initiative it lost by raising the risk somewhere else. That's why the coming period may even be the war's most dangerous phase. But one truth doesn't change. The barometer of this war was never the map. The barometer was whether the men keep coming. And the numbers say only one thing: they're running out. So what do you think about all this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's exclusive analyses, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.